A woman with a broken wrist sits alone in a roadside diner at midnight, bleeding into a napkin she stole from the counter. She has one phone call left, one number she swore she'd delete, one man the entire state of Michigan knows better than to look in the eye. But here's the thing. Nobody tells you about outlaw bikers. The most dangerous ones aren't the ones who come to hurt you. They're the ones who've been waiting their whole lives for someone to finally ask them to come back. Tonight, Kane Holloway is going to ride through a snowstorm with shaking hands and a loaded past. And by the time this story ends, you'll understand why silence is more terrifying than any bullet ever fired. Stay with me all the way through. This one's gonna break you. Hit that like button, drop your city in the comments so I know where you're watching from, and let's ride. Oh, peace. The rain came sideways off Lake Erie and punched through the neon glow of the Royal Oak Diner like something personal. Like the weather had a grudge against the last stretch of Route 12 before Detroit swallowed the road whole. The diner sat between a boarded-up radiator shop and a lot full of dead Chevrolets, the kind of place that survived on truckers, insomniacs, and people who had nowhere else to go at 1:45 on a Wednesday. Ava Mercer was all three. She sat in the last booth by the window, the one with the cracked vinyl seat and a cigarette burn shaped like a half moon near the edge. Her coffee had gone cold 20 minutes ago. She hadn't touched it. Her left hand rested flat on the table, steady, controlled, like she was pressing down on something that wanted to rise. Her right hand stayed hidden beneath the sleeve of an oversized gray sweater. The kind a woman buys 3 sizes too big when she needs fabric between her skin and the world. The waitress, a woman named Donna, who had worked the overnight shift since before Ava was born, noticed the way Ava held herself. The careful posture, the slow breathing, the way she kept her eyes on the parking lot like she was counting the seconds between headlights. Donna had seen that look before. She'd worn it herself for 11 years. She refilled Ava's coffee without asking, set down a clean napkin, didn't say a word. Ava looked up. Her eyes were dry. That was the part that unsettled Donna most. Women who cried were still fighting. Women whose eyes went dry had already made a decision. They just hadn't acted on it yet. "You need anything, honey?" Ava shook her head, then stopped, then nodded once, barely. "A phone," she whispered. "Mine's in pieces on his kitchen floor." Donna pulled a battered flip phone from her apron and set it on the table without ceremony. She walked away and didn't look back. There are moments in a diner at midnight when the kindest thing you can do for someone is disappear. Ava stared at the phone for almost 4 minutes. She knew the number by heart. She'd memorized it when she was 16, scratched it into the inside of a shoebox lid with a ballpoint pen the night she left home. She had called it exactly once in 10 years, the night their father died, when she needed someone to identify the body because she couldn't walk into that hospital room without screaming. She picked up the phone. Her fingers trembled. Not from cold. The line rang 5 times, 6, 7. She was about to hang up when the static shifted and a voice came through, low, rough, like gravel dragged across concrete. "Yeah." One word. No greeting. No name. Just the sound of a man who answered phones the way he answered doors, already braced for bad news. Ava closed her eyes, her throat locked. 10 years of distance collapsed into the silence between 2 breathing patterns on a borrowed phone. "Kane," she said. The line went quiet. Not the quiet of confusion, the quiet of recognition, the specific, devastating kind that happens when a voice you buried alive suddenly climbs out of the ground. "Ava." She pressed her forehead against the cold window. Outside, rain hammered the asphalt in sheets. A semi rolled past on Route 12, its headlights cutting through the dark like something searching. "He broke something," she whispered. And then, quieter, "He finally broke something." Kane Holloway didn't ask what. He didn't ask who. He didn't ask where or when or how bad. Because the answer to every one of those questions lived in the same silence that had been growing between them since they were children, hiding in a hallway closet while their father destroyed the kitchen. "Where are you?" Not a question, a coordinate request. "Royal Oak, the diner on 12. The one with—" "I know which one." The line went dead. Ava set the phone down on the table and stared at it like she'd just pulled the pin on something that couldn't be put back. 47 miles northwest, in a converted warehouse on the outskirts of Flint that served as the clubhouse for the Black Vultures Motorcycle Club, Kane Holloway stood in the freezing dark beside his 2003 Harley-Davidson Road King and tried to light a cigarette with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. He was 41 years old, 6'2", built like a man who had spent his 20s carrying wounded Marines through places the news had already forgotten. His knuckles were scarred white across both hands. Not from fights, though there had been plenty, but from the way he gripped things too hard when the world got loud inside his skull. His leather cut bore the Black Vultures patch across the back, a bird of prey with spread wings over crossed pistons, and the word President stitched beneath it in thread so old it was starting to fray. He'd earned that patch the way most men in the club earned anything, by surviving what should have killed him and being too stubborn to lie down afterward. The cigarette finally caught. He inhaled deep enough to feel it burn behind his sternum. Snow had started mixing with the rain sometime in the last hour, and the air tasted like iron and exhaust, and the kind of cold that doesn't care how many layers you're wearing. He hadn't heard Ava's voice in 3 years. Before that, 5. Before that, the night of the funeral, when she'd stood across the casket from him and looked at him like he was already becoming the thing they'd both sworn they'd never become. Their father. Kane zipped his jacket and swung onto the Harley. The engine turned over with a sound that shook the frozen puddles in the lot. He didn't go inside to tell anyone where he was going. He didn't grab a weapon. He didn't call ahead. He just rode. The highway between Flint and Detroit at midnight in late November is a thing built for ghosts. 4 lanes of cracked asphalt under sodium lights that turn the snow orange. Semis crawling through fog. Exit signs for towns that stopped existing 20 years ago. The kind of road where the only company is the sound of your own engine and the thoughts you've been out running since the day you came home from overseas with blood under your fingernails and no one waiting at the airport. Kane kept the throttle open and his visor up. The snow hit his face like needles. He wanted it to. He needed something sharp and external to keep the inside from taking over, because the inside was already spinning. Ava's voice on the line, that whisper, the specific way she said, broke, like she was describing something that had already healed wrong and then gotten shattered a second time. He knew about Travis Reed. Not much. Enough. Ava had mentioned him once in a text message 2 years ago. A corporate guy, finance something, nice apartment in Midtown. Kane had looked him up because that's what men like Kane did when their sisters mentioned a name. Clean record. Good credit. The kind of man who wore fitted shirts and smiled in photographs and made women feel safe until the door closed. Kane had known men like that in the Marines. The ones who passed every evaluation, shook every hand, kept their violence folded so neatly inside their chests that no one ever saw the creases until it was too late. He rode faster. Back at the diner, Ava moved to the counter because the booth felt too exposed. She kept her back to the wall and her damaged wrist pressed against her stomach beneath the sweater. The pain was a dull, grinding thing. Not the sharp crack of the initial break, but the deep throb that comes after. When the adrenaline wears off and the body starts telling you the truth, your mind tried to refuse. Travis had grabbed her wrist and twisted it behind her back in his kitchen at 9:47 p.m. She remembered the time because she'd been looking at the microwave clock when the pain hit. He'd been calm when he did it. That was the part nobody ever understood. He didn't yell, didn't scream. He just applied pressure with a slow, mechanical precision, like he was tightening a bolt, and said, "See what happens when you don't listen?" She'd driven herself to the diner with one hand on the wheel and her vision blurring from pain. She hadn't gone to the hospital. Not yet. Because hospitals meant questions, and questions meant reports, and reports meant Travis finding out she'd told someone. And the last time she'd told someone, her best friend Megan, 8 months ago, Travis had isolated her so completely that Megan eventually stopped calling. That was how it worked. Not with fists, with systems. He dismantled her life the way an engineer dismantles a machine. One connection at a time, until she was standing alone in a room full of parts that no longer fit together. But tonight something had shifted. The wrist was different. The wrist was bone. The wrist was evidence. And the wrist was what finally made her dial the one number she'd spent a decade pretending she'd forgotten. Donna brought her a fresh cup of coffee and a bag of ice wrapped in a dish towel. Ava looked at her. Donna shrugged. "For whatever hurts," Donna said. "And I ain't asking what." Ava pressed the ice against her wrist beneath the table and bit down on the inside of her cheek hard enough to taste copper. The diner was nearly empty. A long-haul trucker asleep in the corner booth, a teenager with earbuds and staring at a laptop, and a cook in the back whose radio bled country music through the kitchen door like a slow wound. She waited. At 11:58 p.m., the sound arrived before the man did. A deep, rolling thunder that had nothing to do with the storm. The unmistakable growl of a Harley V-twin cutting through the rain, growing louder as it approached the lot. Headlights swept through the diner windows. The trucker stirred. The teenager looked up. Even the cook's radio seemed to go quiet for a second, like the building itself was holding its breath. Then the engine died. Boots hit wet asphalt. The front door opened, and Winter came inside with Kane Holloway. He filled the doorway the way weather fills a room. Not because he was the biggest man in it, but because something about him rearranged the air. Wet leather. Snow melting on broad shoulders. Tattoos crawling up the sides of his neck from beneath the collar of a flannel shirt that hadn't been buttoned properly. His eyes swept the room once. The trucker, the teenager, the counter, the exits. A combat scan. Automatic. The kind of reflex that never leaves a man even 20 years after the war is supposed to be over. Then his eyes found Ava. She was sitting at the counter with her shoulders pulled in tight and her right hand cradling something against her body. She looked smaller than he remembered, thinner, like someone had been slowly removing pieces of her and she hadn't noticed until most of the weight was gone. Kane crossed the diner in 4 steps. His boots left wet prints on the linoleum. Donna moved aside without a word, reading the situation with the kind of fluency that comes from surviving your own version of it. He stopped in front of Ava, looked at her face, the smudge of a bruise near her jawline that she'd tried to cover with concealer that didn't match her skin, the split in her lower lip that she kept touching with her tongue, the way her eyes carried that specific emptiness, not sadness, something past sadness, the flat terrain that exists after a person has cried everything they had and the body just stopped producing it. He reached out and touched her cheek, gently, so gently it made his own hand shake because Kane Holloway's hands were not designed for gentleness, and every nerve in his body knew it. She flinched, not from pain, from the shock of being touched without being hurt. "Let me see," he said. She shook her head. "Ava, it's not. Let me see." She pulled the sleeve up slowly. The wrist was swollen to nearly twice its normal size. The skin mottled purple and yellow. There was a clear deformity near the ulna, the kind that meant something inside had been displaced. Kane stared at it. His jaw tightened. A vein rose along his temple like a fault line about to split. The room went so quiet you could hear the ice machine humming in the back. "Where is he?" Ava grabbed his arm with her good hand. "Don't." "Where?" "Kane, don't. I didn't call you for that." "Then what did you call me for?" She looked at him, really looked at him, the way only a person who grew up in the same burning house can look at the other survivor. "Because I needed someone who already knows what this looks like, who doesn't need me to explain, who isn't going to make me say it out loud like it's something I have to prove." Kane exhaled through his nose. Long, controlled. The exhale of a man who had just redirected an explosion inward and was now standing inside the blast radius trying to survive it. He sat down on the stool beside her. Didn't touch her again. Didn't speak for almost a full minute. Then he pulled a napkin from the dispenser, wrapped it around the ice bag Donna had given her, and placed it carefully against her wrist. "We're going to the hospital," he said. Not a suggestion. "In the morning. Now. Kane, you've got a fracture that needs setting before the swelling locks it in place. If it heals wrong, you lose mobility in that hand. You paint with that hand, Ava." She stared at him. Something flickered behind the emptiness, surprise maybe, that he remembered. That in the middle of whatever war was already building inside his skull, he'd held on to that one detail. She painted. She painted with that hand. "Okay," she whispered. He helped her off the stool. She swayed once and he steadied her with a hand on her back. Broad palm, light pressure, the way you'd hold something you were terrified of breaking further. Donna watched them go. The teenager watched them go. The trucker slept through everything. Outside, the snow had thickened. Kane's Harley sat alone in the lot, black and chrome and streaked with melting ice. He pulled a spare helmet from the saddlebag and fitted it over Ava's head with hands that moved slower than they'd moved for anything in years. "Hold on to me," he said. "Not the wrist. Other arm around my waist." She climbed on behind him and pressed her forehead against the back of his leather cut. The patch smelled like rain and motor oil and something underneath both, the ghost of the cologne their mother used to wear before she stopped wearing anything at all. Kane kicked the engine to life. The Harley roared beneath them both and pulled out of the lot onto Route 12, and the snow ate the sound within seconds. They didn't speak on the ride to the hospital. There are silences between siblings that carry more history than any conversation could, and this one was loaded with 18 years of it. Closet doors and broken glass, and a father whose hands taught them both that love was something that left marks. At Beaumont Hospital, the ER was half empty, but smelled of bleach and exhaustion, and the particular desperation of people who only go to hospitals when they've run out of other options. Kane walked Ava to the intake desk. The nurse behind the counter looked at him. The leather, the tattoos, the eyes. And her posture changed. Not fear exactly. Assessment, the way a person recalculates safety when the equation shifts. "She's got a broken wrist," Kane said. "Someone else broke it." The nurse looked at Ava. "Is that true?" Ava hesitated. 1 second, 2, 3, each one heavy enough to leave a dent. "Yes." The nurse typed something into her computer. Her tone shifted. Softer now. Professional, but careful. The voice of a woman trained to ask the next question without making it feel like an interrogation. "Do you want to file a report tonight?" Ava looked at Kane. He looked straight ahead, didn't nod, didn't shake his head, didn't make the decision for her. Just stood there with his arms folded and his jaw clenched so tight the muscle in his cheek pulsed like a second heartbeat. "Not tonight," Ava said. Kane's eyes closed, just for a moment. The briefest fracture in the stone. They set her wrist in a curtained bay under fluorescent lights that made everything look more damaged than it was. 2 fractures, one clean, one displaced. The orthopedic resident was young, efficient, and kind enough not to stare at the bruise on Ava's jaw while he worked. He asked if she had someone to take her home. She said yes without looking at Kane. A social worker appeared 20 minutes later with a clipboard and practiced sympathy and pamphlets about domestic violence, resources that had been photocopied so many times the text was starting to blur. Ava took the pamphlets. She wouldn't read them. She already knew every word. In the hallway, Kane leaned against the wall with his head tipped back and his eyes on the ceiling. A security guard walked past and gave him a look. The same look Kane had received in every clean, fluorescent-lit space he'd ever entered. The look that said, "You don't belong here." The look that said, "Whatever happened to her, you're probably the reason." Kane was used to it. He'd been the reason for enough things in his life that the assumption wasn't entirely unfair, just misplaced tonight. His phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. A text from Logan Graves, his vice president, his oldest friend, the only man on the planet who could tell Kane to sit down and have Kane actually do it. "Where are you?" "Bike's gone." Kane typed back. "Detroit." "Family." A pause. Then, "Need backup?" Kane stared at the screen. The word backup meant something different in their world. It didn't mean emotional support. It meant bodies. It meant engines. It meant a line of Harleys appearing out of the dark with men on them who had already decided how the night was going to end. "Not yet," he typed. Then deleted it. Typed instead, "I'll let you know." He put the phone away. Through the curtain gap, he could see Ava sitting on the examination table with her newly casted wrist resting on her lap and her eyes focused on nothing. She looked exactly the way their mother had looked in the kitchen at 2 a.m. 30 years ago. Present in body, evacuated in everything else. And that was the image that broke him. Not the fracture, not the bruise, the vacancy. The way trauma empties a person from the inside out until what's left is just a shape that remembers how to breathe. Kane pushed off the wall and walked outside into the snow. He stood in the ambulance bay with his hands in his jacket pockets and his breath rising in pale columns and the cold pressing against his face like a punishment he deserved. An ambulance sat idling nearby, its red light spinning slow circles across the wet concrete. He pulled out his phone again and called Logan. "I need you to find someone," Kane said. "Who?" "Travis Reed, Midtown Detroit, finance sector, mid-30s, clean cut, probably drives something German." A pause. Then Logan's voice, low and careful. "What did he do?" Kane looked back at the hospital entrance. Through the glass doors, he could see Ava at the discharge counter, signing paperwork with her left hand because her right hand was now encased in plaster. "He broke my sister's wrist," Kane said, "and based on what I'm seeing, it wasn't the first time he put his hands on her." The silence on the line lasted exactly 3 seconds. When Logan spoke again, his voice had dropped into the register that meant he'd already stopped thinking of Travis Reed as a person and started thinking of him as a problem. "Give me an hour." The line went dead. Kane stood in the snow and finished his cigarette and watched the red ambulance lights paint circles on the pavement and felt something ancient and familiar rise inside his chest. The thing that had kept him alive in Fallujah. The thing that had earned him the presidency of a club full of damaged men. The thing he had promised himself he would learn to control before it controlled him. Rage. Not the hot kind. Not the screaming kind. The other kind. The one that goes quiet. The one that sits behind your eyes like a patient animal and waits. Inside the hospital, Ava was signing discharge papers with a pen that kept slipping because her good hand was shaking. She paused halfway through her signature and stared at the blank white wall across from the nurses' station. She thought about calling the police. She thought about calling Megan. She thought about driving back to Travis's apartment and confronting him with the cast still wet on her arm. Then she thought about the look on Kane's face when he'd seen her wrist, the way his eyes hadn't widened or flinched or shown shock. They'd shown recognition, the same look he used to wear when they were kids and their father would come home late and the sound of the front door closing meant everything was about to get worse. She finished signing. Outside, Kane was already on the phone again, this time with Donna at the diner. "She left her bag in the booth," Donna said. "Green shoulder bag. Under the table." "I'll pick it up." "Your sister?" Kane paused. "You knew?" "Honey, I've been watching women walk through that door for 32 years. I know what it looks like when someone's driving away from the person who's supposed to love them. You just tell her she's welcome anytime, no questions." Kane hung up and stood in the falling snow and felt something press against the back of his throat. Not tears, because Kane Holloway hadn't cried since he was 19, and a Marine sergeant told him his best friend had bled out in a ditch in Anbar province. But something adjacent to tears, something that occupied the same space in the body but refused to leave through the eyes. Ava came out of the hospital entrance. The automatic doors slid apart, and the fluorescent light behind her made her look like a ghost stepping out of the afterlife. Her casted arm was in a sling now, pressed against her chest. She looked small. She looked exhausted. She looked like a woman who had been holding herself together with nothing but stubbornness and was about to run out. "I can't go home," she said. Kane nodded. He'd expected that. Home was Travis's apartment. Home was the kitchen with the microwave clock. Home was the place where her wrist had been a functioning joint 6 hours ago. "You're staying with me," he said. "Kane, I can't just—" "You're staying with me. At the clubhouse. Nobody touches you there. Nobody gets past the gate." She stared at him. The Black Vulture's clubhouse. The place she'd spent her entire adult life distancing herself from. The world of leather and engines and men who solved problems with the kind of silence that preceded violence. The world she'd left because it reminded her too much of their father. The world that now, tonight, in the snow, with her wrist in a cast and her life in pieces, was the only place on earth where a locked door actually meant something. "Okay," she said. So quiet the snow almost ate it. They rode back north on Route 12. The snow had turned heavy, covering the road in a white layer that made the Harley's tires hiss. Ava held on with her good arm and pressed her cheek against Kane's back and watched the city lights shrink in the side mirror until Detroit was just a glow on the horizon behind them. Somewhere in Midtown, Travis Reed sat in his apartment with a glass of bourbon and no marks on his hands because men like Travis didn't leave marks on themselves. He was already composing the narrative in his head, the version where Ava was unstable, volatile, prone to exaggeration. The version where her wrist was an accident. The version where he was the victim of a woman who couldn't control her emotions and a family of criminals who would obviously take her side. He didn't know about the hospital records. He didn't know about the x-rays. He didn't know that somewhere on a frozen highway heading north, a man who had survived 2 combat tours and buried 6 brothers in the ground was carrying his sister through a snowstorm with a rage so deep it had already gone past sound and into something structural. And he didn't know that by tomorrow morning, a man named Logan Graves would know his home address, his workplace, the make and model of his car, and the name of every person he'd ever hurt. The snow kept falling. The Harley kept moving. And somewhere in the dark between Detroit and Flint, Ava Mercer closed her eyes against her brother's back and felt, for the first time in 2 years, the terrifying and unfamiliar sensation of being inside a space where no one was going to hurt her. She didn't trust it. She couldn't. Trust was the first thing Travis had broken, long before the wrist. But for now, just for the length of this highway, just for the duration of this engine's growl beneath her, she let herself breathe. The clubhouse appeared out of the dark like a ship run aground. A sprawling warehouse at the end of a dead-end road, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire, lit by a single floodlight that turned the falling snow into static. A row of Harleys sat beneath a corrugated metal overhang, chrome catching the light, engines already cold. The Black Vulture's flag hung above the main door, wet, heavy, barely moving. Kane pulled through the gate and killed the engine. The silence that followed was enormous, the kind of silence that only exists in places where noise has earned its right to stop. Ava didn't move. She stayed pressed against his back, her good hand still gripping the leather at his side, like letting go would mean falling into something she couldn't climb out of. "We're here," he said. "I know. You can let go." "I know." She didn't. Inside the clubhouse, 5 men sat at a long wooden table beneath a haze of cigarette smoke and a ceiling fan that had stopped working in October and nobody had bothered to fix. Logan Graves was at the head, mid-50s, silver-bearded, thick arms covered in fading military tattoos, a man whose face carried the permanent expression of someone who had already calculated every possible outcome and found all of them disappointing. Beside him, a younger member named Wren was cleaning a carburetor with a rag that was dirtier than the part he was working on. 2 prospects sat near the door, nursing beers and saying nothing, because prospects who spoke without being spoken to didn't stay prospects long. Logan looked up when Kane came through the door with Ava behind him. He saw the sling. He saw the cast. He saw Kane's face. He didn't say a word. He just stood up, walked to the back room, and came out 30 seconds later with a pillow, a blanket, and a bottle of bourbon. He set them on the end of the table closest to the wood-burning stove, then looked at Ava with the kind of gentleness that catches you off guard from a man who looks like he could bend rebar with his bare hands. "Couch in the back room's clean," he said. "Door locks from the inside. Nobody goes in there without your say-so." Ava looked at him, then at Kane, then at the room full of men who had stopped what they were doing and were now looking at her with a silence she couldn't decode. Not pity, not curiosity, something else, something quieter and older and harder to name. Recognition, maybe. The recognition of people who understood damage because they'd been living inside their own for years. "Thank you," she said. Logan nodded once, then sat back down and resumed his conversation with Wren about the carburetor like nothing had happened. Because in this world, privacy wasn't given through absence. It was given through the deliberate choice not to look. Kane walked Ava to the back room. It was small, a couch, a space heater, a window that looked out over the fenced lot. The walls were bare except for a framed photograph of a group of young Marines standing in front of a Humvee in some desert that could have been anywhere. Kane was in the photograph. So was Logan. So were 4 other men whose names Ava would never learn because 2 of them were dead and 2 of them had disappeared into the kind of silence that meant they didn't want to be found. Ava sat on the couch. Kane set the pillow behind her and unfolded the blanket and draped it over her legs with a precision that looked military. Corners tucked, edges straight. The muscle memory of a man who had spent years making beds in places where order was the only thing standing between you and chaos. "I'll be outside," he said. "Kane." He stopped at the door. "What are you going to do?" He looked at her. and in his eyes she saw the answer he wouldn't give, the one that lived in the space between the man he was trying to become and the man he'd been trained to be. "Get some sleep," he said. He closed the door. She heard the lock click from her side, then his boots on the concrete floor moving away, then the low murmur of voices in the main room, too quiet to make out words, but the tone was unmistakable. The tone of men receiving information that was about to change the temperature of everything. Ava lay back on the couch and stared at the ceiling and held her casted wrist against her chest like a secret she hadn't decided whether to keep or release. Outside in the main room, Logan was already pulling up information on his laptop, a battered ThinkPad that looked like it had been dropped out of a helicopter, because it had. Travis Reed's social media, Travis Reed's LinkedIn, Travis Reed's employer, a mid-tier financial consulting firm in a glass tower on Woodward Avenue. "Clean," Logan said. "Aggressively clean. No record, no complaints. Donates to 3 charities. Sits on a community board." "That's the type," Kane said. Logan looked at him. 26 years of friendship condensed into a single glance that said everything neither of them was willing to put into words. "What's the play?" Kane sat down, lit a cigarette, stared at the ember for a long time. "I don't know yet." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I've got." Logan closed the laptop, leaned back. The chair creaked beneath his weight. "Kane, I've known you since Fallujah. I've seen you do things I'll never talk about, and I've watched you spend the last 15 years trying to become a man who doesn't do those things anymore." He paused. "Don't let this be the thing that undoes it." Kane didn't respond. He smoked. He stared at the table, and somewhere beneath the silence, something ticked. Not a clock, not a bomb, but the slow, mechanical rotation of a man deciding what kind of damage he was willing to become. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. He opened it, read it once, read it again. Then set the phone face down on the table and pressed both hands flat against the wood like he was trying to hold himself to the earth. Logan watched him. "What?" Kane's voice came out scraped clean, stripped of everything except the raw infrastructure of sound. "That was Travis Reed. He just texted Ava's old number, the one forwarded to mine." He swallowed. "He says if she talks to anyone about tonight, he'll make sure everyone knows she's the one who's violent. He's already told her friends. He's already told her employer." A pause. The snow hit the window behind them like static. "He says he has photographs, staged ones, bruises he put on himself." Logan's expression didn't change, but his hands, resting on the table, slowly curled into fists. "He's not running," Logan said quietly. "He's building a case." Kane stared at the phone. The screen had gone dark, but the words were still there, glowing behind his eyes, like something radioactive. "He's not afraid of her," Kane said. "He's not afraid of the police. He's already got the story written. Then we need to unwrite it." "How?" Logan looked toward the back room where Ava was sleeping. Or not sleeping, more likely lying in the dark with her eyes open and her wrist throbbing and her mind replaying every moment she'd stayed when she should have left. "That," Logan said, "is not our decision to make." Kane stood up, walked to the window, pressed his forehead against the cold glass and watched the snow bury the row of Harleys outside one flake at a time. Behind him, his phone buzzed again. Another text. Same number. He didn't read it, not yet, because the first one was still burning, and Kane Holloway knew from experience that when the ground starts shifting beneath your feet, the worst thing you can do is look down. But somewhere in Midtown Detroit, Travis Reed was not sleeping either. He was sitting at his desk, composing emails, organizing files, building the architecture of a lie so thorough and so clean that by the time anyone thought to question it, the truth would already be buried beneath 6 layers of documentation and the quiet professional testimony of a man who had never once raised his voice in public. The snow kept falling, and in a locked room at the back of an outlaw clubhouse, Ava Mercer lay awake with her broken wrist cradled against her chest and a question burning through her skull like a wire-heated white. What happens when the predator isn't the one in leather, but the one in a pressed suit who already knows exactly how to make you disappear without ever touching you again? Ava didn't sleep. She lay on the couch in the back room of the Black Vulture's clubhouse, with her eyes open and her casted wrist resting on her stomach and the space heater clicking in the corner like a metronome counting down to something she couldn't name. The ceiling was water-stained. The window rattled every time the wind shifted. Somewhere on the other side of the locked door, she could hear the low murmur of men's voices. Not the words, just the frequency, the particular bass register that men use when they're discussing something they don't want to be overheard discussing. She knew that sound. She'd grown up with that sound. Her father on the phone at 3 a.m. in the kitchen, his voice dropped to a register that meant someone owed him something, or someone had crossed a line, or someone was about to learn what happened when you made a mistake in front of men who didn't believe in second chances. She sat up. The pain in her wrist had settled into a deep, rhythmic pulse that synced with her heartbeat, a second clock inside her body, ticking out the hours since everything changed. She looked at the cast. Stark white. Pristine. The cleanest thing about her right now. In the main room, Kane hadn't moved from the table. The ashtray in front of him held 6 cigarette butts. His coffee was untouched and cold. Logan sat across from him with the laptop open again, the blue light of the screen throwing shadows beneath his eyes that made him look 10 years older than he already was. Third text came in 20 minutes ago, Logan said. Same pattern. He's not threatening her directly. He's threatening the narrative. I hope she gets the help she needs. I'm documenting everything for my own protection. My attorney has advised me to preserve all communications. Logan looked up. This isn't panic, this is strategy. Kane stared at the phone on the table. His jaw worked beneath the skin like something mechanical, grinding through bone. He's building the frame before the picture even exists, Logan continued. By the time she files anything by a police report, a protective order, even a complaint to HR, he'll already have documentation showing he was the reasonable one, the concerned one, the one who saw the warning signs and tried to help. You sound like you've seen this before. Logan closed the laptop slowly. My ex-wife's second husband did the same thing to her for 4 years. Different tools, same architecture. He paused. She didn't get out, not until it was too late to get out clean. Kane looked at him. In 26 years, Logan had never mentioned his ex-wife's second husband, not once. And in the culture of the Black Vultures, a culture built on silence, on the understanding that a man's past was his own territory, that kind of absence wasn't unusual. But the way Logan said it now, the specific weight he placed on the words, too late, told Kane that whatever had happened was still alive in there somewhere, coiled in a room Logan had locked a long time ago and never opened. What happened to him? Kane asked. He moved to Arizona. That's not what I asked. Logan picked up his coffee. Drank. Set it down. He moved to Arizona. That's the version that exists. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of every unspoken answer that would never be recorded, never testified to, never confirmed. The kind of silence that men like Logan and Kane had learned to build around the things they'd done. Not to hide them, but to contain them, the way you'd contain a fire that had already done its damage, and the only question left was how much of the surrounding structure could be saved. Wren appeared from the kitchen doorway, holding 2 mugs of fresh coffee. He set one in front of Kane and one in front of Logan without being asked, because Wren was 29 years old and had spent 3 tours in Afghanistan as a combat medic, and had learned that in the spaces between crisis events, the most useful thing a man could do was keep people fed, hydrated, and caffeinated. He'd been patching the Black Vultures together, literally sometimes, with needle and thread and expired butterfly bandages for 5 years now. He had a medical degree he'd never finished, and hands that were steadier than any surgeon's when everything around him was falling apart. He looked at Kane. Your sister awake? Probably. She should eat. She won't. Then I'll leave something outside the door. Wren shrugged. She eats when she eats, but the offer has to exist. He disappeared back into the kitchen. A moment later, the sound of a pan hitting a burner, eggs cracking, bread being slotted into a toaster that took 3 tries to catch. Simple sounds. Domestic sounds. The kind that had no business existing inside a building guarded by razor wire and populated by men with federal files. And yet they did, because that was the contradiction at the heart of the Black Vultures. The violence existed to protect the quiet, and the quiet existed to justify the violence, and somewhere in between, damaged men learned how to scramble eggs at 4 a.m. for a woman they'd never met because her brother was sitting at their table with murder in his eyes. And they understood that the most dangerous thing they could do right now was nothing. Kane's phone buzzed again. He didn't touch it. "You need to read those," Logan said. "I know what they say. You need to read them so we have a record." Kane picked up the phone, opened the messages. 3 new texts from Travis's number, each one crafted with the surgical precision of a man who understood how language could be weaponized. The first: "I'm concerned about Ava's mental state. She left in a very agitated condition, and I want to make sure she's safe." The second: "I've reached out to her friend Megan to let her know what happened. I think Ava may need professional intervention." The third: "For the record, I never touched her. If she's claiming otherwise, I have documentation that tells a very different story." Kane read them once, twice, a third time. Each reading drove the words deeper, like nails being hammered into wood that was already splitting. "He contacted Megan," Kane said. Logan leaned forward. "Her friend?" "The one he already isolated. The one he's been feeding his version to for months." Kane set the phone down. "He's not just building a case against Ava. He's turning her own people into witnesses for his side." "Screenshots?" "Already saved." "Good. Don't reply. Don't engage. Don't let him know this number isn't hers." Kane nodded. But his eyes had changed. The exhaustion had burned away, and something colder had taken its place. Something Logan recognized from a firefight in Ramadi in 2004, when Kane had gone quiet for exactly 12 seconds before doing something that earned him a commendation and a psych evaluation in the same week. "Kane, I hear you. I need you to hear me specifically, because what I'm about to say is going to piss you off." Kane looked at him. "You can't touch him," Logan said. "Not physically, not through a proxy, not through anyone connected to this club. Because the second you do, every text he sent becomes evidence that he was right, that her family is violent, that she surrounds herself with dangerous men, that she's the one who created the situation." Logan's voice was steady, measured, the voice of a man who had learned to speak through the wreckage of other people's worst decisions. "He's baiting you. Every one of those texts is written to provoke a response that he can use. If you show up at his door, he wins. If you threaten him, he wins. If anyone wearing a Black Vulture's patch goes anywhere near his building, his car, or his goddamn mailbox, he wins. So what? We wait? We don't do anything. She does." The words landed like a slap. Kane pushed back from the table. His chair scraped against the concrete floor with a sound that cut through the room like a blade. The 2 prospects near the door looked up. Ren appeared in the kitchen doorway. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. "She's lying in the back room with a broken wrist and a man systematically destroying her credibility, and you're telling me to sit here. I'm telling you that this fight isn't yours to win, it's hers. And if you take it from her, even with good intentions, you're doing the same thing he did. You're making the decision for her. You're telling her she can't handle her own life." Kane stood motionless. His hands hung at his sides, fingers curling and uncurling with the slow rhythm of a man fighting an internal war whose outcome would determine the trajectory of everything that came next. He wanted to hit something: the wall, the table, the empty space where Travis Reed's face should be. He wanted to ride south and put his boot through a glass office door and drag a man in a press suit across a marble lobby by his throat. He wanted to be the thing everyone already assumed he was: the violent outlaw, the unhinged biker, the man who solved problems with his fists because his fists were the only tools that had never let him down. But Logan was right. Logan was always right. That was the curse of having a best friend who'd survived the same war as you but come out the other side with his logic still intact. Kane sat back down. The chair groaned beneath him. He picked up his coffee and drank it cold and said nothing for a very long time. Down the hallway, a door opened. Footsteps. Lighter, uneven. The gait of someone favoring one side. Ava appeared in the main room still wearing the clothes she'd arrived in, the sling pressing her casted arm against her chest. Her eyes were rimmed with the particular redness that comes not from crying, but from hours of lying still in the dark, while your brain replays every moment you wish you could unlive. Every man in the room shifted without moving. Not a lean or a turn. Something subtler, an adjustment of posture, a recalibration of energy. The way soldiers adjust when a civilian enters a command post. Not alert, exactly. Aware. The conscious decision to soften the atmosphere without changing the architecture. Ava looked at the table. The laptop, the phone swoon, the ashtray. Kane's face. "You've been up all night," she said. "Wasn't tired." Liar. A flicker. Almost a smile. It died before it landed. She sat down at the table. Ren materialized with a plate, scrambled eggs, toast, a cup of coffee, and set it in front of her without ceremony. "You don't have to eat it," he said. "But it's there." She looked at the plate, then at Ren. Something crossed her face, the specific disorienting confusion of receiving kindness from a stranger in a place where she expected to feel nothing but out of place. "Thank you," she said. "I'm Ren. Ava." "I know." He sat down across from her with his own coffee. "You want something for the pain? I've got ibuprofen, acetaminophen, and a topical lidocaine patch that fell off a supply truck in ways I won't get into." She almost laughed. Almost. The sound caught in her chest and converted itself into something that wasn't quite a cough and wasn't quite a sob and lived somewhere in between. The noise a body makes when it doesn't know whether the danger is over or just changing shape. "Ibuprofen's fine," she said. Ren nodded and left. Logan pushed the laptop toward Kane and stood up. "I'm going to make some calls, quietly." He looked at Ava. "Your name won't come up. Neither will his. I just need to know the landscape." Ava frowned. "What landscape?" "Your boyfriend, ex-boyfriend, works in finance. Men in finance who hurt women don't usually start with one. I want to know if he has a pattern." The words hung in the air. Ava's hand, reaching for the coffee, stopped mid-motion. She stared at Logan with an expression that Kane recognized. The specific shock of hearing someone articulate a possibility you had sensed but never allowed yourself to think. "You think there are others," she said. "I think men who build the kind of infrastructure he's building don't build it from scratch. They refine it, each time, each woman." Logan paused at the doorway. "It's not about you. It was never about you. You were just the next room in a house he's been building for years." He walked out. The front door opened and closed. A moment later, the sound of his boots on the frozen gravel outside, then his phone, then his voice, low, measured, speaking to someone Ava would never meet about things she would never be told. She picked up the coffee, drank, set it down. Her hand was shaking, but the shake was different now. Not fear, not pain, something harder. Anger, the slow geological kind that starts deep beneath the surface and takes a long time to reach the point where it becomes visible. "He's already contacted Megan," Ava said. Kane looked at her. "How do you know?" "Because that's what he does. He poisons the well before you even know you're thirsty." She touched her cast absently. "Megan stopped talking to me 8 months ago. I thought it was because I'd been distant, because I'd been canceling plans, because I'd become the kind of person people stop calling." She paused. "But it was him. He was the one canceling. He'd take my phone when I was in the shower and respond to her texts for me. He'd say things I would never say, cold things, dismissive things. And by the time I noticed, she'd already decided I wasn't worth the effort." Kane's cigarette had burned down to the filter. He hadn't taken a single drag. The ash fell onto the table in a silent column and disintegrated. "There's more," Ava said. "He told my boss I was struggling with substance abuse, said he was concerned, said he didn't want to make it formal, just wanted someone to keep an eye on me. My performance review last quarter mentioned reliability concerns. I couldn't figure out where it came from. Now I know." She looked at Kane with eyes that had passed through every stage of grief and come out the other side into a territory that didn't have a name yet, a place beyond sadness, beyond fury, beyond the helpless devastation of realizing that the person you loved had been methodically dismantling your life while you slept beside them. "He didn't just hurt me, Kane, he erased me. He turned me into a fiction, and the worst part is—" Her voice cracked. Just once. A hairline fracture in the surface. "The worst part is, I helped him do it. Every time I made an excuse, Every time I explained away the bruise, every time I told myself it wasn't that bad, I was writing his story for him. Kane reached across the table. His scarred hand covered hers, the good one, the one without the cast, and held it with a pressure so careful it was almost not there at all, like holding a bird, like holding a flame, like holding the one thing in the world you cannot afford to crush. "You didn't write anything," he said. "You survived something. There's a difference." The kitchen fell silent. Ren stood in the doorway with a bottle of ibuprofen in his hand and didn't move. The two prospects stared at the floor. Outside, the wind pushed snow against the windows in patterns that looked almost intentional, like the weather was trying to write something the people inside were too tired to read. Ava ate 3 bites of scrambled eggs. It was the first food she'd had in 14 hours. She chewed slowly, mechanically, the way people eat when the act of nourishing yourself feels like a rebellion against the part of your brain that says you don't deserve it. Then she set the fork down and said, "I'm going to his office." Kane's head came up. "What?" "Monday morning, I'm walking into his office with the hospital records and the x-rays, and I'm going to stand in front of every person he works with and tell them what he did." The room temperature dropped. Not literally. The wood-burning stove was still putting out heat, but something in the atmospheric pressure of the space shifted, the way air shifts before a storm makes landfall. "Ava, don't say it's dangerous. Don't say I should let lawyers handle it. Don't say I should wait." "I wasn't going to say any of those things." "Then what?" Kane looked at her. His sister. The girl who used to paint landscapes on the back of cereal boxes because they couldn't afford canvases. The girl who learned to read people's footsteps on stairs because knowing whether the feet coming were angry or drunk or both could mean the difference between a bruise and a broken rib. The girl who had rebuilt herself from nothing after leaving home at 17 and had done it without the club, without the leather, without the brotherhood, had done it entirely alone because she believed that alone was safer than surrounded. "I was going to say I'll be outside," Kane said. "On the bike. Across the street, for however long it takes." Ava stared at him. Something moved behind her eyes. Not trust, not yet, but the ghost of it. The outline. The place where it might eventually stand if the ground held. "You won't come in." "No." "You won't touch him." "No." Even if. She looked at him for a long time. The kind of look that searches for the lie behind the promise, the crack in the dam, the hidden agenda behind the offered hand. She had learned to search for these things because Travis had taught her that every act of kindness was a transaction. Every promise was a contract with hidden clauses. Every hand extended toward her had fingers that could close into a fist. But Kane's eyes held steady. Not soft, not warm, just present. The eyes of a man who was making a promise he might have to break every instinct in his body to keep. "Okay," she said. The weekend passed like a held breath. 2 days of snow and silence and the strange liminal existence of a woman rebuilding her plan inside a fortress made of concrete and motorcycle engines and men who communicated more through what they didn't say than what they did. Ava spent Saturday in the back room with the door locked, on the phone with the hospital requesting copies of her records, the x-rays, the attending physician's notes, the social worker's documentation. The hospital was cautious. Forms had to be signed. Identification had to be verified. The system moved slowly, deliberately, the way all systems move when the person inside them is asking for evidence of the thing the system exists to prevent. Ren checked on her every 3 hours, not by knocking. He'd set a tray outside the door with water, food, ibuprofen, and once, a paperback novel he'd pulled from a shelf in the common room. The book was a thriller with a bent spine and a coffee stain on page 47. Ava read 12 pages before she realized she'd absorbed nothing. She set it aside and went back to staring at the cast. Kane spent Saturday on the phone with a woman named Janet Polk, a legal aid attorney who had represented 2 other women from the broader motorcycle community in protective order cases. He hadn't told Ava about this call. He wasn't sure he would. Janet was cautious, thorough, and entirely unintimidated by the fact that she was speaking with the president of an outlaw MC. If she wants to confront him publicly, that's her right, Janet said. But she needs to understand the risks. If he's already building a counter-narrative, a public confrontation gives him material. He can reframe it as harassment, instability, proof that she's the aggressor. She's got hospital records. Hospital records document an injury. They don't document who caused it. Not legally. Not until someone takes a statement under oath. Kane leaned against the wall outside the clubhouse, his breath fogging in the frozen air. A crow sat on the razor wire above the gate, watching him with the particular indifference of a creature that understood violence but had no opinion about it. So what does she need? She needs to file a report first, before the confrontation. Establish the record. Then, if she wants to go to his workplace, she does it with documentation already in the system. It changes the sequence. It makes his counter-narrative reactive instead of preemptive. Kane was quiet for a long moment. She's not going to want to wait. Nobody ever does. But the women who build their case before they pull the trigger are the ones whose cases survive. The ones who move on emotion alone. Janet paused. They're the ones he's counting on. That night, Kane sat alone in the main room after everyone had turned in. The wood-burning stove was down to embers. The wind had shifted and was coming from the north now, pushing the temperature into single digits. He could hear the Harleys outside contracting in the cold, tiny metallic clicks and pops, like the machines were having conversations of their own. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through Travis's messages again. 9 texts now, each one more measured than the last, each one constructing another wall in the architecture of the lie. The most recent one read, I've spoken with a counselor who specializes in personality disorders. I believe Ava may be experiencing a dissociative episode. I'm reaching out with compassion, not anger. I just want her to get help. Kane read it 3 times. The word compassion sat in the sentence like a razor blade hidden in cotton. This was the language of a man who had studied how to weaponize concern, who understood that in the court of public opinion, the person who sounds most reasonable wins, regardless of what they've done behind closed doors. He wanted to respond. He wanted to type 3 words, I know what you are, and send them like a bullet. But Logan's voice was in his head, and Janet's, and the voice of every disciplined instinct he'd spent 15 years building. Don't react. Don't engage. Don't give him the response he's designed this to produce. He put the phone away. He stared at the dying stove, and he sat with the rage the way a man sits with a wound that's been stitched but not yet healed, aware of every pulse, every pull, every moment the thread threatens to give way. Sunday morning. Logan arrived at 7 a.m. with information that changed everything. He walked in with snow on his shoulders and a manila folder in his hand and the expression of a man carrying something that weighed more than paper. Sit down, he said. Kane was already sitting, but something about Logan's tone made him straighten, the way a body straightens before impact. I made some calls, the quiet kind. People who know people who work adjacent to his firm. Logan opened the folder. There are 2 other women. One filed a complaint with HR 18 months ago and withdrew it within a week. The other left the company entirely, moved out of state, no forwarding address, no social media since 2023. Kane stared at the folder. Names? I've got one. The one who filed and withdrew, Rebecca Soto. She's still in Detroit, works at a nonprofit on the east side. Logan set the folder down. I didn't contact her, that's not my call. It's Ava's. It's Ava's. The door to the back room opened. Ava stood in the hallway, fully dressed, her hair pulled back and her casted arm out of the sling. She'd heard everything. The walls in a converted warehouse are not thick, and the silence of an early Sunday morning carries voices like water carries sound. Perfectly, mercilessly, without distortion. Say the name again, she said. Logan looked at Kane. Kane looked at Ava. Rebecca Soto, Logan said. Ava walked to the table and sat down. She didn't ask how Logan had found the name. She didn't ask about the second woman. She looked at the folder and then at Kane, and her eyes held something that hadn't been there the night she called from the diner. Not strength exactly, but the precursor to it. The geological shift that happens before the surface changes. The moment the ground decides it's done being still. I'm filing the report today, she said. Then I'm calling Rebecca Soto. Then on Monday morning, I'm walking into his office. Kane opened his mouth. "I'm not asking," Ava said. He closed it. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, but the sky remained the color of wet concrete, low, heavy, pressing down on the city like a hand flattening something that was trying to rise. The Harleys in the lot were buried under 3 inches of white. A prospect was out there with a broom, sweeping the seats clean, because even in crisis, especially in crisis, the machines got cared for. That was the discipline. That was the ritual. You maintained the thing that carried you because someday it would carry you again, and when that day came, you needed to trust it would start. Ava filed the police report at 2:17 p.m. on Sunday afternoon at the Flint PD precinct closest to the clubhouse. Kane drove her on the Harley. He waited in the parking lot. He smoked 4 cigarettes in 45 minutes and watched the door with the focus of a man standing guard outside a room where something irreversible was happening. Inside, Ava sat across from a detective named Maria Vasquez, who took notes with a pen that kept running out of ink and had to be shaken back to life every few sentences. Ava gave her statement. She described the kitchen, the microwave clock, the exact rotation of Travis's hand on her wrist, the sound it made when the bone displaced, not a crack, more of a wet pop, like stepping on a branch buried in mud. Detective Vasquez didn't flinch. She wrote everything down. She asked follow-up questions that were precise and unhurried, and carried the tone of a woman who had done this exact interview hundreds of times and understood that the most important thing she could offer was not sympathy, but patience. "Do you have a safe place to stay?" Vasquez asked. "Yes." "Do you want me to know where that is?" Ava hesitated. She thought about the clubhouse, the razor wire, the men with federal files and military ghosts, and a way of solving problems that existed outside the systems this detective represented. "No," she said. "Not yet." Vasquez nodded. She didn't push. She handed Ava a case number written on a yellow card and said, "Call me if anything changes, day or night." Ava took the card and walked out into the cold, and stood beside Kane's Harley and breathed and felt something inside her chest shift. Not relief, not quite, but the sensation of a door opening into a room she hadn't known existed. The room where the record now lived. The room where her story existed in someone else's handwriting on official paper in an official building, and no amount of texts or staged photographs or weaponized concern could erase what had been documented in ink. Monday morning, 8:47 a.m. The glass tower on Woodward Avenue, where Travis Reed spent his days analyzing portfolios and attending meetings, and being the kind of man that other men described as solid and dependable and someone you'd want on your team. The lobby was all marble and chrome and the kind of silence that costs money. A security guard sat behind a curved desk reading something on his phone. 3 employees waited for an elevator, coffee cups in hand, faces blank with the particular emptiness of people who had not yet been fully awakened by their caffeine. Ava walked through the revolving door at 8:51 a.m. She was wearing a dark coat over a sweater. Her casted wrist was visible, deliberately visible, the sling removed, the cast held at her side where anyone looking would see it. In her good hand, she carried a folder. Inside the folder, hospital records, x-ray prints, the police report case number, and a written statement she'd composed at 5 a.m. on the back of a Black Vulture's logistics invoice because it was the only paper she could find. Across Woodward Avenue, Kane Holloway sat on his Harley in the freezing wind with the engine idling and his hands on the grips and his eyes locked on the glass entrance of the building. Snow was falling again, light, persistent, the kind that accumulates without drama and buries everything an inch at a time. His leather was already wet. His fingers were already numb. He didn't care. He was going to sit on that bike for as long as it took, because he had made a promise, and this was the only way he knew how to keep it without breaking something else. Inside the lobby, Ava paused. Just for a second. The security guard glanced up at her, and then at the cast, and then back at his phone. She walked to the elevator, pressed the button for the 14th floor. The doors closed. And as the elevator rose, she felt something crystallize in her chest. Not courage, because courage implies a choice, and this no longer felt like a choice. It felt like gravity, like falling forward, like the moment you realize you've already stepped off the edge, and the only direction left is the one that ends in impact. On the 14th floor, the doors opened onto a carpeted hallway lined with glass-walled offices. She could see Travis's desk from where she stood. Corner office, blinds open, the back of his chair turned toward the door. He was on the phone. His voice drifted down the hall, professional, measured, the voice of a man who had never lost control of anything in a space that had witnesses. Ava stepped out of the elevator. And somewhere across the street, Kane Holloway gripped the handlebars of his Harley hard enough to whiten every scar on both hands and felt the exact shape of the war he was no longer allowed to fight. A war that was now entirely in the hands of a woman walking alone through a glass building toward the man who had broken her, carrying nothing but paper and the truth and the terrifying knowledge that by the time this hour was over, one of their stories would be destroyed forever. And the only thing standing between her and annihilation was whether the people in that building chose to believe the woman with the cast or the man with the corner office. The hallway stretched in front of her, 37 steps to his door. She started walking. 29 steps. 23. 18. Ava's boots made no sound on the carpeted hallway of the 14th floor. The building hummed around her, climate-controlled air pushing through overhead vents, the muffled percussion of keyboards behind glass walls, a phone ringing somewhere to her left that nobody answered. The fluorescent lights above cast everything in a flat, institutional pallor that erased shadows and softened edges and made the world look like a photograph taken with the contrast turned all the way down. She could see him now. Not just the back of his chair, but the side of his face, the jaw, the ear, the careful hairline. Travis Reed, 36 years old, sitting in a leather chair that cost more than the motorcycle parked across the street, speaking into a phone with the practiced ease of a man who had never been interrupted by anything he couldn't manage. 12 steps. Her heart was hammering, not in her chest, in her throat, in her wrist, in the space behind her eyes where the pain had been living for 2 years. The folder in her good hand felt simultaneously weightless and impossibly heavy, like carrying a document that contained the detonation codes for her own life. 7 steps. A woman at a desk to Ava's right looked up. Mid-40s, reading glasses pushed onto her forehead, a paper coffee cup leaving rings on a quarterly report. She saw the cast. She saw Ava's face. Something registered, not recognition, but the primal assessment that women perform when another woman enters a space with that particular expression. The expression that says, "I am here to do something that cannot be undone." 3 steps. Ava stopped in the doorway of Travis's office. He was still on the phone, his chair angled toward the window, his voice threading through a conversation about portfolio rebalancing with the smooth, unhurried cadence of a man who believed the world would wait for him because it always had. She didn't knock. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't announce herself. She walked in and set the folder on his desk, directly on top of the spreadsheet he'd been reviewing. Travis turned. His eyes found her face, then the cast, then the folder, then her face again. The phone call continued in his hand. Someone on the other end saying something about yields and exposure, but his mouth had stopped moving. For exactly 2 seconds, Travis Reed's entire carefully constructed machine stuttered. Then it recalibrated. "I'll call you back," he said into the phone. Calm, professional. The voice of a man adjusting to an unexpected variable, not a man confronting the woman whose wrist he'd snapped 3 days ago. He hung up, set the phone on the desk, looked at Ava with an expression that was designed to project concern. Brow slightly furrowed, lips parted, head tilted at the precise angle that communicates empathy in boardrooms and mediations in every controlled environment where emotion is a tool. "Ava," he said, "I've been worried about you." She didn't speak. Not yet. Because she could feel the trap in his tone, the way his concern was already a frame, already positioning the next 5 minutes as a conversation between a worried man and an unstable woman who had walked uninvited into his workplace. If she spoke too soon, she'd be reacting. If she reacted, he'd be directing. And she was done being directed. She opened the folder instead. The X-ray sat on top. The fracture was visible even to a non-medical eye. A clean white line through the ulna and a displacement near the joint that looked like something had been pulled apart and rearranged. Below the X-ray, the attending physician's notes. Below that, the social worker's intake form. Below that, the yellow card with the police case number. She placed each document on his desk with deliberate spacing. 1, 2, 3, 4. The way you'd lay cards in a game you'd already decided to win. Travis stared at the documents. His hands, resting on the armrests of his chair, didn't move. But something changed in his posture. A tightening in the shoulders, a micro-adjustment in the angle of his spine. The barely perceptible shift of a man whose internal mathematics had just been disrupted by a variable he hadn't accounted for. "You filed a report," he said, not a question. "Saturday. Before coming here." "Yes." The word hung between them. Travis's jaw tightened, just once, just enough for Ava to see the muscle in his cheek flex. The same muscle that flexed when he was angry. The same one that preceded the moment his hand had closed around her wrist in the kitchen 3 nights ago. But they weren't in a kitchen now. They were in a glass-walled office on the 14th floor of a building full of witnesses, and the woman at the desk to the right had stopped pretending to work and was watching openly. And somewhere down the hall a door had opened and a man in a blue tie was standing in the corridor with a coffee cup, looking at the scene with the slow dawning comprehension of someone realizing they were witnessing something that would be discussed in this office for years. "Ava." Travis lowered his voice, intimate, controlled, the register he used when he wanted her to feel like they were alone even when they weren't. "You're clearly upset, and I understand, but this isn't the place." "This is exactly the place." Her voice didn't shake. She had expected it to. She had rehearsed this moment in the back room of the Black Vultures clubhouse at 5 a.m. while composing her statement on the back of a logistics invoice, and in every rehearsal, her voice had trembled. But standing here, in the actual moment, in the actual glass box where this man performed his daily theater of normalcy, something inside her had solidified. Not courage, something colder. The specific, clear-eyed clarity that arrives when you realize you have nothing left to protect, because the thing you were protecting was already destroyed. "You broke my wrist on Wednesday night," she said. Not loud. Not a whisper either. The precise volume that carries across an open-plan office without sounding like an accusation. The volume that sounds like a fact. 2 fractures, 1 displaced. These are the X-rays. This is the physician's report. This is the police case number. Travis stood up. Not fast. Slowly, the way a man stands when he wants to project calm but his body is running on adrenaline. His hands went to his pockets. A calculated posture, non-threatening, reasonable. "I don't know what you think happened," he said, "but I never touched you, and I have documentation. You have staged photographs and texts sent to a phone number you didn't know wasn't mine anymore." Ava's voice held. "I have bone. I have X-rays. I have a physician who documented the mechanism of injury as consistent with forceful rotational trauma, the kind that doesn't happen from falling or bumping into something, the kind that happens when someone grabs your wrist and twists." The hallway outside the office was no longer empty. 3 people stood at varying distances, pretending to be in transit but stationary. The woman at the desk had removed her reading glasses. The man in the blue tie had been joined by another man, older, grayer, with the posture of someone who signed paychecks. Travis's eyes swept the audience. And in that sweep, Ava saw it. The first crack. Not guilt, not remorse, fear. The particular white-knuckled fear of a man who has spent years controlling every narrative in every room and is watching, in real time, as the room slips out of his hands. "I think we should discuss this privately," Travis said. "No. Ava, the last time we discussed something privately, you broke my wrist. So no." She picked up the physician's report and held it where the growing audience could see it. "This is what private looks like with you." Travis's composure fractured, not into anger, into something more dangerous. The cold, brittle smile of a man whose mask has cracked and is trying to hold the pieces together with the muscles of his face. "You need help," he said. Soft, almost tender, the tone of a man who had practiced this exact sentence in front of a mirror. "I've been saying that for months. I tried to get you help. I reached out to your friend, your employer. You contacted my friend to isolate me. You contacted my employer to discredit me. And you sent 9 texts to what you thought was my phone, building a counter-narrative designed to make me look unstable before I could tell anyone the truth. She paused. Let the silence fill the space. I have all 9 texts, the police have all 9 texts, and every single one of them was sent after you broke my wrist. The room was changing. Not physically. The walls were the same glass, the lights the same fluorescent white. But the atmospheric pressure had shifted the way it shifts before a weather system makes landfall. The older man in the hallway had pulled out his phone and was typing something. The woman at the desk had opened a drawer and was looking for something. A form, maybe. Or a number. Or the specific document that HR departments keep for situations exactly like this one. Travis took a step toward Ava. One step, small, instinctive. The step of a man who is accustomed to closing distance when he wants to regain control. Ava didn't step back. She planted her feet and looked up at him and let him see, for the first time in 2 years, the version of herself that existed before he started dismantling her. The version that was not afraid of him, had never been afraid of him, had only been slowly, systematically trained to believe that she was. Sit down, Travis. He sat. Not because she told him to, because his legs gave out, because the chair was behind him, and gravity was faster than his pride, and for the first time in his adult life, the room was not doing what he told it to do. The older man from the hallway entered the office. He introduced himself as the division director. His voice was professional but taut, like a wire being tightened one notch past comfortable. He asked Ava if she needed medical attention. He asked if she wanted security to be present. He asked if she was willing to speak with HR. Ava said yes, to all of it. And as she was escorted down the hall toward a conference room by a woman from Human Resources, whose face carried the specific exhaustion of someone who had suspected something like this for a long time, but had never been given the evidence to act on it, Ava looked back once. Travis was still sitting in his chair, alone, his hands flat on the desk, his eyes focused on the X-ray she'd left behind, the image of the bone he'd broken, rendered in white against black, irrefutable and permanent, and now sitting on his desk like a photograph of the inside of his own consequence. Across the street, Kane Holloway had been sitting on his Harley for 1 hour and 43 minutes. The engine had been off for the last 30 because the cold had worked through his gloves and into his knuckles, and the idling vibration was making his hand shake in a way he couldn't tell apart from the tremor that lived inside him permanently, the one the VA doctor had called essential tremor, and Kane called the cost of carrying a rifle for 4 years in a place where every sound might be the last sound you ever heard. His phone buzzed, a text from Logan. Rebecca Soto called back. She's willing to talk, not to us, to Ava. Kane typed, Ava's inside. Still waiting. How long? As long as it takes. He put the phone away and stared at the glass building and watched the snow accumulate on his handlebars and tried not to think about what was happening on the 14th floor. Tried not to imagine Ava standing in front of that man with nothing between them but paper and truth. Tried not to calculate the distance between the street and the elevator and the hallway and the office. 12 seconds on the bike to the entrance. 40 seconds through the lobby, another 60 in the elevator, another 10 down the hall. 2 minutes and 2 seconds between where he sat and where she stood. He had run longer distances in less time under fire. He had covered more ground carrying more weight in worse conditions with bullets cutting the air beside his ears. Every muscle in his body knew the route. Every reflex was already plotting the trajectory. But he sat still. Because the promise he'd made wasn't about distance. It was about the specific, agonizing discipline of trusting someone to fight their own war while you sit in the cold and accept that you cannot carry this one for them. Not because you're unable, but because carrying it would mean taking it, and taking it would mean she never gets to own what she's about to do. So he sat, and shook, and smoked, and waited. Inside the conference room, Ava spent 2 hours with an HR representative, the division director, and a second woman who introduced herself as in-house counsel. They were thorough. They were careful. They documented everything with the methodical precision of people who understood that the next phase of this situation would be legal, not emotional, and every word spoken in this room would eventually be read by someone who wasn't present. Ava told them everything. The wrist, the isolation, the manipulated text messages to Megan, the fabricated substance abuse report to her own employer, the 9 texts sent to what Travis thought was her phone. She spoke for 45 minutes without stopping, and her voice held the entire time. Not because the pain wasn't there, but because the pain had become structural, had become the foundation she was building on rather than the weight she was collapsing under. When she finished, the in-house counsel excused herself. 5 minutes later, she returned with the look on her face that Ava couldn't read. Not shock, not sympathy, something more complicated. Something that looked like the expression of a person who had just opened a door they'd been told was locked and found what they suspected was behind it all along. "Ms. Mercer," the counsel said, "we'd like to share something with you. We're not required to, and I want to be clear that what I'm about to tell you is still under internal review. But given the circumstances and given the seriousness of your complaint, we believe it's relevant." Ava's pulse spiked. She could feel it in her cast, the rhythmic throb accelerating, the bone itself seeming to register the change in atmospheric pressure. 9 months ago, we received a complaint from an employee named Rebecca Soto regarding Travis Reed. The complaint alleged a pattern of controlling behavior, emotional manipulation, and one incident of physical intimidation during a work-related event. Ms. Soto withdrew the complaint after 2 weeks. The counsel paused. She cited personal reasons, but her resignation followed within a month. The room went quiet. The hum of the HVAC system became the loudest sound. Ava stared at the counsel and felt the floor beneath her shift. Not literally, not physically, but the kind of internal tectonic movement that happens when a suspicion you've been afraid to have is confirmed by someone who has no reason to lie. "There were others," Ava said. The counsel held her gaze. She didn't confirm or deny. She simply said, "We are conducting a comprehensive review of all complaints related to Mr. Reed, past and present. Your documentation has been incorporated into that review." Which meant yes. Which meant the architecture Logan had described, the pattern, the refinement, the systematic repetition, was real, was documented, was known by people inside this building who had allowed it to continue because the evidence was never enough, and the women always withdrew, and the man in the corner office always had a reasonable explanation wrapped in reasonable language delivered in a reasonable tone. Ava stood up. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else, functional but foreign, operating on a program she didn't remember writing. She thanked the HR representative. She thanked the counsel. She walked out of the conference room and down the hallway and past the glass offices where people were pretending to work, but watching her with the particular intensity of people who understood that the woman walking past them had just detonated something beneath the floor they were all standing on. She reached the elevator, pressed the button, waited. The doors opened. Travis was standing inside. He'd been heading down, to the lobby, to the street, to wherever men go when the building they've spent years controlling starts to collapse around them. He was wearing his coat. His briefcase hung from one hand. His face was the color of wet cement, gray, inert. The face of a man whose internal structure had been compromised and was now just managing the rate of collapse. They stood 2 feet apart in the elevator doorway. The doors tried to close, hit the sensor, reopened, tried again, reopened. Travis spoke first. His voice was low, the intimate register, the one he used in kitchens. "You've destroyed my career." Ava looked at him. "You destroyed my wrist." That's exactly what this is. You thought you could break me and then write a story where you were the hero. You thought the texts and the staged photos and the weaponized concern would be enough because it's always been enough before. Because Rebecca pulled her complaint. Because the other woman left the state. She watched his face change. A flicker, minute, the subtlest contraction of muscle around his eyes. The flicker of a man hearing a name he didn't expect. "Yeah, I know about Rebecca." The elevator doors tried to close a 3rd time. "And I know about the one who disappeared," Ava said. "The one who scrubbed her social media and moved so far away that nobody could find her. I don't know her name yet, but I will, because the police will, because your company's legal team will. Because the thing about architecture, Travis, and you love architecture, don't you? The careful construction of narratives and frameworks and controlled environments? The thing about architecture is that it only works if the foundation holds. And the foundation just cracked. Travis said nothing. His hand on the briefcase handle had whitened at the knuckles. His lips were pressed together in a line so thin it looked drawn with a razor. And behind his eyes, Ava could see it. Not remorse, not guilt, not the collapse she'd hoped for, but calculation. Even now. Even standing in an elevator with his career disintegrating above him and the truth closing in from every direction. He was calculating. She stepped aside. Let him pass. He walked through the lobby without looking at anyone and pushed through the revolving door into the snow. Across the street, Kane saw him exit. Every molecule in his body locked. His hands on the grips became vices. His breath stopped. For a span of time that could have been 2 seconds or 2 centuries, the world reduced itself to one point. The man walking through falling snow toward a silver sedan in the parking structure, and the biker on the Harley who could cross that distance before the man reached his car. Kane didn't move. Travis got in his car, pulled out, drove east on Woodward. The sedan disappeared into traffic and snow and the particular anonymity that cities provide to men who are running from things they can't outrun. 7 minutes later, Ava walked out of the building. She crossed the street. The snow caught in her hair and on her eyelashes and on the white surface of the cast that had become, over the past 3 days, the most important document in her possession. More important than the x-rays, more important than the police report, because the cast was the thing itself. The evidence made material. The truth made visible and permanent and impossible to rewrite. She stopped in front of Kane. He was still on the Harley, still gripping the handlebars. His leather was soaked. His face was raw from 2 hours of wind and cold. His eyes were red. Not from tears, from the specific physiological response that happens when a man holds himself perfectly still for an extended period, while every nerve in his body demands movement. "It's done," she said. "Yeah? There are other women, at least 2. His company knew about one of them. They're doing a full review." Kane exhaled, a long shaking breath that came from somewhere deeper than his lungs. He looked at her, at the cast, at her face, at the specific way she was standing, and something about her posture had changed. Not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who hadn't spent 41 years decoding the body language of people who'd been through damage. But Kane saw it. The spine was different. The shoulders were different. The weight distribution had shifted from defensive to structural, from a woman bracing for impact to a woman standing on her own foundation. "He saw me leaving," Ava said. "In the elevator. He said I destroyed his career." "What did you say?" "I told him about Rebecca." Kane's jaw tightened. How did he take it? Like a man running math in his head. Even at the end, still calculating. Kane looked east toward the direction Travis's car had disappeared. The traffic on Woodward was thick and slow and anonymous. Thousands of cars carrying thousands of people who had no idea that the silver sedan 3 lanes over contained a man whose carefully built world was entering a state of freefall. "Get on," he said. Ava climbed on the Harley, wrapped her good arm around his waist, pressed her forehead against the wet leather of his cut. Kane kicked the engine to life, and the sound filled the canyon of the street like something alive and ancient, and they pulled out into traffic heading north. They were 11 minutes into the ride when Kane's phone buzzed in his jacket. He felt it against his chest but didn't answer. Not at 60 miles an hour on a wet highway with his sister on the back. He waited until they reached a gas station on the outskirts of Pontiac, pulled in, killed the engine. He checked the phone. 2 messages from Logan. He read the first one and his face didn't change. He read the second one and it did. "What?" Ava said. She'd been watching him, reading him the way she'd been reading men her entire life. Not for what they said, but for the microsecond between receiving information and composing a response. The microsecond where the truth lives before the mask goes back on. Kane handed her the phone. The first message. "Rebecca Soto is willing to meet, tomorrow. She has documentation of her own." The second message. Problem. "Travis's attorney just contacted the Flint PD. He's filing a counter report. Claims Ava attacked him on Wednesday night. Claims he has medical records showing defensive injuries. Claims he's being stalked and harassed by members of an outlaw motorcycle gang. He named the Black Vultures specifically. He named you specifically, Kane. He's requesting a protective order against both of you." Ava read it twice. 3 times. The screen blurred and she realized her eyes were wet for the first time since Wednesday night. Not from sadness, but from the specific, devastating exhaustion of watching a man you've just exposed begin rebuilding his lie before the dust has even settled. "He's turning it around," she said. Her voice was hollow, scraped out. The voice of a woman who had walked through fire and come out the other side only to find that the fire had followed her. "He's using you. He's using the club. He's making this about the bikers, not about the wrist." Kane took the phone back, stared at it. The snow fell around them in the gas station lot, covering the fuel pumps, the cracked concrete, the Harley's chrome, everything. His breath came out in pale clouds that the wind tore apart before they could form anything solid. "He's smart," Kane said quietly. "He's a predator." "Those aren't different things." He pocketed the phone, lit a cigarette. His hands were shaking again, not from cold, not from the tremor, from something deeper. The specific vibration of a man standing at the intersection of two impossible roads, the one where he does nothing and watches a predator weaponize his own existence to destroy his sister's case, and the one where he does something and proves the predator right. "If he gets that protective order," Ava said, "everything I did today becomes his evidence. The office confrontation becomes harassment. The police report becomes part of a coordinated campaign. And you, Kane, if they connect you to the Black Vultures, if they see that I spent the weekend at the clubhouse," he reframes the entire thing. "Unstable woman under the influence of a criminal organization. It writes itself." Kane smoked. He didn't argue. Because she was right. Every word she said was architecturally correct. And the architect was a man who had been building these structures for years, and each one was better than the last because he learned from every woman who tried to stop him. "So I disappear," Kane said. "What?" "From this. From your case. From your life for now." His voice was flat, operational. The tone of a Marine briefing a mission he didn't believe in but was going to execute anyway. "I pull back. The club pulls back. No contact, nothing traceable. We become the thing we've never been. Invisible." Ava stared at him. That's exactly what it is. Because right now I'm not your protector. I'm his evidence. Every minute I stand next to you, I make his case stronger." He flicked the cigarette into the snow. It hissed and died. "The most dangerous thing I can do for you right now is exist." The gas station was silent except for the wind and the distant sound of traffic on the highway. A fluorescent light above one of the pumps flickered in a rhythm that seemed almost intentional. On, off, like a signal being sent to someone who had already stopped watching. Ava's good hand reached out and gripped Kane's arm, hard, fingers pressing through wet leather into the muscle beneath. Not the grip of a woman seeking comfort, the grip of a woman refusing to let go. "You don't get to leave," she said. "You don't get to ride away and call it sacrifice. You don't get to make yourself the casualty so you don't have to watch." "Ava, no. You listen to me. I spent 2 years with a man who made every decision for me and called it love. I will not spend one more minute with a man who makes decisions for me and calls it protection. They're the same thing, Kane. The mechanism is the same. The only difference is the packaging." The words hit him like a round to the chest. Not because they were cruel, because they were true. Because somewhere in the marrow of his logic, in the place where his instinct to shield and his instinct to control had always been tangled together like wires in a damaged harness, her words found the short circuit and blew it open. He stood there, wet, cold, shaking. A 41-year-old man standing in a gas station parking lot in Pontiac, Michigan, being told by his younger sister that his brand of love looked the same as the thing she'd just escaped. Different hands, same grip. "Then tell me what to do," he said, and his voice broke. Not dramatically, not with a sob, just a hairline fracture across the last syllable. The crack of a man whose foundation had just shifted and was trying to hold the structure above it while the ground settled. Ava looked at him for a long time. The snow fell between them. The fluorescent light flickered. A truck pulled into the station and the driver got out without looking at them, because people at gas stations have their own emergencies and nobody else's ever registers. "Stay," she said, "but not in front of me, behind me, not as my shield, as my witness." Let me fight this. Let me be the one who walks through the door. Let me be the one who speaks. And when it's over, when this is finished, you can stand next to me again. But right now I need you behind me. Not because I'm weak, because if you're in front of me, everyone will look at you instead of listening to me, and I need them to listen. Cain looked at her, his sister, standing in the snow with a broken wrist and a folder full of evidence and a predator rebuilding his case behind her, and a brother whose entire identity had been built around the act of stepping between the people he loved and the things that hurt them. She was asking him to unlearn the only thing he knew how to do. She was asking him to become a man he had never been, not the protector, not the guardian, not the wall between danger and the people behind it. Something else, something harder. The man who stands behind the wall and watches someone else hold the line. Okay, he said. One word, the heaviest word he'd ever spoken. They got on the Harley and rode north through the snow toward the clubhouse. Behind them, somewhere in Detroit, Travis Reed was sitting in a parking garage in his silver sedan with his phone pressed to his ear, speaking to an attorney whose hourly rate could fund a family for a month, constructing the next layer of the lie. The version where the bikers were the villains, the woman was the weapon, and the man with the broken career was the victim of a coordinated assault by people who lived outside the law. And in a quiet apartment on Detroit's east side, Rebecca Soto sat at her kitchen table staring at a phone number she'd written on a post-it note, the number Logan Graves had left on her voicemail, and made a decision that had been building inside her for 18 months. She picked up the phone. She dialed. When the line connected, she said 5 words that would change everything. I kept the hospital records. Rebecca Soto's kitchen smelled like cold coffee and the particular staleness of an apartment where the windows hadn't been opened in weeks. The blinds were drawn. The overhead light was off. Only a small lamp on the counter cast a yellow circle across the table where she sat with both hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't drank from. She was 32 years old. Dark hair pulled into a knot at the base of her neck. No makeup. A cardigan buttoned to the throat despite the heat being set to 74. She had the posture of someone who had trained herself to take up as little space as possible. Shoulders pulled in, elbows close to the body, chin slightly lowered. The physical vocabulary of a woman who had spent months making herself small enough to avoid detection. Ava sat across from her. The cast on her wrist rested on the table between them like a bridge. White, visible, undeniable. Neither woman had spoken for almost 30 seconds. The silence wasn't awkward. It was the silence of recognition. 2 people looking at each other across a table and understanding, without a single word being exchanged, that they had lived inside the same room with different furniture. He used the same line on you, Rebecca said finally. Not a question. Which one? You need help. He says it like he means it. Like he's the only person who can see how broken you are. Like caring about you and controlling you are the same thing. Ava's jaw tightened. Yeah, that one. Rebecca looked at the cast. Her eyes traced the edge of the plaster from wrist to knuckles. He never broke anything on me. Not bone. He was smarter with me. He kept it to things that don't show. Pressure on the arms, grip marks that faded in a day. Once he held the back of my neck so hard I couldn't turn my head for a week. But nothing that would photograph. Nothing that would X-ray. She paused. He learned from me. Whatever he did to you, the escalation. That's because I got away before he finished refining the method. The words landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Ava stared at Rebecca and felt something open inside her chest. Not sympathy, something raw, something that lived at the intersection of rage and grief and the devastating clarity of understanding that her suffering was not unique, that it was an iteration, a version, a draft in a series of drafts by a man who revised his cruelty the way other men revised business plans, systematically, incrementally, each time closing the gaps that had allowed the previous woman to escape. He filed a counter report, Ava said, yesterday. Claims I attacked him. Claims he's being stalked by an outlaw motorcycle club. Rebecca's hand around the mug tightened. He did that with me too, not the motorcycle club part, but the counter report, the narrative flip. He called my mother and told her I was having a breakdown. He emailed my therapist Ava, and expressed concern about my escalating paranoia. By the time I withdrew my complaint, half the people in my life thought I was the problem. Why did you withdraw it? Rebecca was quiet for a moment. Her thumb traced the rim of the mug in slow circles. Because I was alone. Because every person I tried to tell had already heard his version first. Because the HR department treated me like a liability, not a victim. And because she stopped, swallowed. The sound was audible in the silent kitchen. Because he told me he had photographs of me, private photographs, taken without my knowledge. And he implied, never said directly, he's too careful for that they would surface if I pursued the complaint. The room contracted around them. The lamp on the counter flickered once, a loose bulb or a surge in the wiring, and for a second the kitchen went dark before the light steadied and returned.
Do you think he still has them? Ava asked. I think he has them for all of us. I think that's part of the architecture. Insurance, the thing he holds in reserve in case everything else fails. Rebecca looked up. Her eyes were dry. You said us. How many? At least one more. A woman who left the company and disappeared. No social media since 2023. No forwarding address. Sarah. Rebecca said the name like she was handling something fragile. Sarah Kilman. She worked in compliance. She left 6 months before I filed my complaint. Nobody knew why. She just dissolved. 1 week she was at her desk, the next she was gone. I tried to reach out. Her number was disconnected. Her email bounced. Ava pulled out her phone. I need to tell my brother. The biker. Yeah. Rebecca studied her for a moment. Is he the kind of man who's going to show up at Travis's door? He's the kind of man who wants to, but he won't. You sure? Ava paused. The honest answer lived in the space between certainty and hope. The space where she trusted Kane's promise, but understood the weight pressing against it from the inside. I'm sure enough, she said. She texted Kane. 3 words. There's a third woman. The response came in 11 seconds. Name, Sarah Kilman. Disappeared 2023. Rebecca says Travis may have photographs. Of all of them. Private. Taken without consent. The response took 47 seconds this time. Long enough for Ava to feel the silence on the other end like a physical force. The silence of a man processing information that was rearranging everything he thought he knew about the shape of the threat. Coming to you. 20 minutes. Don't leave. Ava stared at the screen. Don't leave. Not an order. A coordinate lock. The language of a man who needed to know where the people he was protecting were standing so he could position himself accordingly. Not in front, not anymore, but within range. Close enough to matter. Far enough to keep his promise. At the Black Vulture's clubhouse, Kane was already moving. He walked into the main room where Logan was sitting at the table with the laptop and 2 phones, one personal, one prepaid, and a map of Detroit spread out beneath both like a surgical field. Ren was in the corner rewrapping the grip tape on a set of handlebars that belonged to one of the prospect's bikes, his hands moving with the automatic precision of a man whose body performed mechanical tasks while his mind processed something else entirely. Third woman, Kane said. Sarah Kilman. Worked in compliance at Travis's firm. Left the company and disappeared in 2023. Rebecca says Travis has private photographs of his targets. Leverage, insurance, whatever you want to call it. Logan's hand stopped moving on the keyboard. He looked up at Kane with an expression that Kane had seen exactly twice before. Once in Ramadi, when their patrol walked into an ambush that should have been on the intel map, but wasn't. And once when Logan's ex-wife called him from a hospital in Phoenix, and he'd had to listen to the sound of a ventilator in the background while a doctor explained what too late meant. Photographs, Logan repeated, taken without consent, used as leverage to silence complaints. That's not domestic violence anymore. Logan's voice had dropped into the register that Kane recognized, the one that meant the tactical landscape had shifted, and every assumption made prior to this moment needed to be discarded and rebuilt from the ground up. That's a federal crime. Wiretapping statute, possible extortion. If he distributed or threatened to distribute intimate images, he implied it. Rebecca says he never stated it directly. He wouldn't, that's the whole point. He builds the threat through implication so there's no language to prosecute. Logan closed the laptop.
But the photographs exist somewhere on a device, a cloud account, a hard drive, and if they exist, they can be found. Ren set down the grip tape. We can't find them. Both men looked at him. We can't, Ren repeated. Not us, not anyone connected to the club. The second any member of the Black Vultures is linked to a search of Travis Reed's digital property, his counter-report becomes a conviction. Stalking, harassment, conspiracy. He's already named the club. He's already named Kane. We go anywhere near his data, we hand him everything he needs. The room went quiet. The wood-burning stove popped, a pocket of sap igniting inside a log, and the sound was startlingly loud in the silence, like a gunshot heard through a wall. Kane stood at the window. Outside, the row of Harleys sat beneath their blanket of snow, chrome buried, engines cold. The sky was the color of ash, a flat, featureless gray that pressed down on the landscape like a weight and made the afternoon feel like dusk. Then who? Kane said. The police, Logan said. If Rebecca and Ava file a joint complaint, separate incidents, same perpetrator, same methodology, and include the information about the photographs, a judge can authorize a search warrant for his devices. That's not us going after him. That's the system doing what it's supposed to do. The system hasn't done what it's supposed to do for any of these women so far, because none of them had corroboration. Rebecca was alone. Sarah was alone. Ava was alone until she called you. But two women filing independently with matching patterns, and a third who disappeared under suspicious circumstances, that's not a he said, she said anymore. That's a pattern, and patterns get warrants. Kane turned from the window. His face was drawn, the skin stretched tight over the bones in a way that made him look 10 years older than he had a week ago. The exhaustion wasn't physical, or rather, it was physical, but the physical was just the symptom. The disease was deeper. The disease was the specific corrosive fatigue of a man whose entire life had been built around direct action, discovering that direct action was the one thing that could destroy everything. I need to talk to Rebecca, Kane said. In person. No, Logan said. Logan, you show up at that woman's apartment, a man she's never met, president of the club Travis already named in his counter-report, and you hand him another witness, another connection, another link in the chain he's building. Logan stood up. The chair scraped. His full height filled the space between them. 6'1", 220 pounds, silver beard, the bearing of a man who had commanded respect in places where respect was survival. I'll go. You're in the club. I'm a veteran with an honorable discharge and no criminal record who happens to ride with a motorcycle club on weekends. That's how any attorney would frame it. Your record is different. Your profile is different. Your name is already on a document sitting in a Flint PD file. Logan's voice was steady, but his eyes were hard. Let me do this. Kane stared at him. 26 years of trust compressed into a look that carried more weight than any conversation they'd ever had. 26 years of shared foxholes and shared roads, and the specific bond that forms between men who have pulled each other out of the dark so many times they've lost count of who owes whom. Okay, Kane said. Logan nodded, grabbed his jacket, walked out. Through the window, Kane watched him cross the lot to his Harley. A 2006 Electra Glide, black and chrome, maintained with the obsessive precision of a man who treated his machine the way a sniper treats a rifle. Logan swung on, kicked the engine, and pulled out through the gate. The sound of the Harley faded down the dead-end road until it was nothing but a vibration in the air and then nothing at all. Kane stood alone in the clubhouse. Ren had gone back to the grip tape. The two prospects were outside shoveling the walkway. The wood stove crackled. The building ticked and settled in the cold, and for a moment the entire world reduced itself to the sound of Kane Holloway breathing in an empty room, trying to hold together a situation that was crumbling faster than anyone could rebuild it. His phone buzzed. Detective Vasquez. Mr. Holloway, I'm calling because your sister's case has been flagged due to a counterfiling by Travis Reed. I need to ask you some questions. Go ahead. Have you had any direct contact with Mr. Reed since your sister filed her report? No? Have any members of your motorcycle club had contact with Mr. Reed? No. Are you aware that Mr. Reed has requested a protective order against both you and your sister? Kane's hand tightened around the phone. I'm aware. The hearing is scheduled for Thursday. I'm going to be direct with you, Mr. Holloway. Your sister's case is strong. The medical evidence is clear. But the counterfiling complicates things. If Mr. Reed can demonstrate that he's being targeted by an organized group, it shifts the narrative. My sister came to me because she had nowhere else to go. I brought her to a safe location, and I've stayed out of contact with Reed entirely. That's the truth. I believe you, but the truth and what a courtroom hears aren't always the same thing. A pause. There's something else. We received a call from a woman named Rebecca Soto this morning. She wants to file a report against Reed as well. A separate incident, similar pattern. If her report is credible, and based on the initial call it appears to be, the combined filings strengthen your sister's case significantly. Rebecca has information about a third victim. The line went quiet. Not the quiet of surprise, the quiet of a detective recalculating the scope of an investigation that had just expanded beyond its original borders. I'm going to need that name, Vasquez said. Sarah Kilman. Former employee at Reed's firm. Left the company in 2023. No current contact information. Rebecca also indicates that Reed may possess unauthorized intimate photographs of his victims, used as leverage to prevent complaints. The silence that followed lasted 6 seconds. Kane counted them. In his experience, the length of a silence after critical information was delivered told you more about its impact than any verbal response. 6 seconds was significant. 6 seconds was a detective reaching for a new legal framework because the old one no longer contained the situation. That changes things, Vasquez said. I'm going to escalate this. Separate division. If there are photographs, we may be looking at charges well beyond what your sister initially reported. How long? To investigate? Days, at minimum. To act? It depends on what we find. Thursday is the protective order hearing. I know, I'm going to request an expedited review with the DA's office. No guarantees, but 2 independent complaints with a similar pattern and the possibility of a third victim and unauthorized recordings. That's not a restraining order case anymore. That's something else entirely. She hung up. Kane put the phone down on the table and pressed both palms flat against the wood and stood like that for a long time. Head bowed, shoulders rigid, the posture of a man holding a weight that wasn't on his back but inside his chest. Wren looked up from the grip tape. You okay, Prez? Kane didn't answer. He pushed off the table and walked to the back room where Ava had slept and stood in the doorway and looked at the empty couch, the folded blanket, the space heater still clicking in the corner. The room smelled like the sleep of a frightened person. Warm, stale, faintly metallic, the scent the body produces when it's unconscious but never fully at rest. His phone buzzed again. Logan, at Rebecca's. She's in. She'll file tomorrow morning. She's got documentation, dated journal entries, screenshots of his texts before he could delete them, and a medical report from a clinic visit she never submitted to HR. She kept everything. Kane read the message twice, then typed, The photographs? She doesn't know where he keeps them, but she's certain they exist. She caught him with his phone angled toward the bed once. He played it off. She never confirmed, but she knows. Kane stared at the screen. The blue light of the phone illuminated his face in the dim room, carving shadows beneath his eyes and along the line of his jaw. He looked like a photograph of himself taken in bad lighting. All contrast, no softness, the geography of a face that had been weathered by things that couldn't be fixed by rest or tissue time or any amount of distance from the source. One more thing, Logan texted. Rebecca says Sarah Kilman's mother still lives in Dearborn. She has an address. If we find Sarah, we find the third complaint. Kane closed his eyes. Behind the darkness of his eyelids, the map of the situation assembled itself. Not a plan, not yet, but a topology. The shape of the terrain. Travis Reed on one side with his attorney and his counter-report and his architecture of lies. Ava and Rebecca on the other side with medical records and screenshots and the specific irreducible power of truth told by women who had survived the same man. And somewhere in the middle, hidden and silent and possibly unreachable, Sarah Kilman, the woman who had disappeared, the ghost in the pattern, the third point that would turn a line into a geometry that no courtroom could ignore. Thursday.
The hearing was Thursday. 3 days. 3 days to find Sarah Kilman. 3 days to assemble 2 independent complaints into a coordinated case. 3 days to do all of this without Kane or anyone connected to the Black Vultures appearing anywhere near the process, because the moment they did, Travis's counter-narrative activated, and the story stopped being about a man who broke women and became a story about a motorcycle gang harassing an innocent man. Kane opened his eyes, walked back to the main room, sat down. Wren was watching him with the quiet attention of a man who had spent 3 tours reading the vital signs of people under extreme stress. "You haven't eaten since yesterday," Wren said. "Not hungry?"
That wasn't a question about hunger. That was a medical observation. Wren set down the grip tape. "You're running on adrenaline and nicotine and whatever's left of the caffeine from this morning. Your hands are shaking. And before you blame the tremor, I've known you for 5 years, and I know the difference between your baseline shake and the one you get when your cortisol's been maxed for 72 hours straight." Kane looked at him. "Eat something," Wren said, "or I'll tell Logan you're deteriorating and he'll come back here and make you eat. And we both know that conversation is worse than a sandwich." Despite everything, despite the weight and the exhaustion and the slowly tightening vice of a situation that was compressing everyone inside it, Kane almost smiled. Almost. "Make it quick," he said. Wren disappeared into the kitchen. The sound of a refrigerator opening, a knife on a cutting board, bread being pulled from a bag. Simple sounds. The sounds of a man maintaining the basic infrastructure of survival while everything outside the kitchen was falling apart. Tuesday bled into Wednesday. The hours passed with the specific grinding slowness of time during a crisis. Each minute waited, each hour an eternity. The clock on the wall moving with the reluctant pace of something being dragged against its will. Rebecca filed her report on Tuesday morning. Different precinct, different detective, same pattern described with different details and the same underlying architecture. The control, the isolation, the gradual dismantling of a woman's external supports until she was standing alone in a room with a man who had engineered her solitude. Detective Vasquez linked the 2 cases by Tuesday afternoon. By Wednesday morning, the DA's office had assigned a prosecutor, a woman named Kathleen Greer, who specialized in cases involving serial patterns of intimate partner violence and had a reputation for treating each filing not as an isolated incident, but as a data point in a larger structure. Ava learned about Greer from a phone call with Vasquez on Wednesday evening. She was sitting at the table in the Black Vultures clubhouse, her Cass propped on a stack of motorcycle manuals, her phone on speaker. "Greer wants to meet with you and Rebecca separately before the hearing," Vasquez said. "She's requesting an emergency motion to delay the protective order until the expanded investigation is complete." "Will it work?" "It depends on the judge, but the existence of 2 independent complaints and evidence of a potential 3rd victim creates grounds for a continuance. Greer is good. She knows how to frame it." "And Sarah Kilman?" A pause. "We're looking. Her mother's address in Dearborn is confirmed, but we haven't made contact yet. These things take time." Time. The one thing none of them had. Ava hung up and looked at Kane. He was sitting across from her, the same position he'd been in for most of the past 3 days, elbows on the table, hands wrapped around a mug, eyes focused on something beyond the walls of the room. "Vasquez can't find Sarah fast enough," Ava said. "I know. Logan has her mother's address." "I know. If someone who isn't connected to the club, I already thought of it." Kane set the mug down. "Janet Polk, the legal aid attorney. She's not connected to the club. She's an officer of the court. If she makes contact with Sarah's mother and locates Sarah, it's a legal professional conducting outreach on behalf of a client, not a biker gang hunting down a witness." Ava stared at him. "When did you call Janet?" "This morning. She's driving to Dearborn tomorrow." "You should have told me." "I'm telling you now." The tension between them was different from the tension of the first night. Not the raw, bleeding urgency of a broken wrist and a midnight phone call, but something more structural. The friction between 2 people who loved each other and were learning, in real time and under impossible pressure, how to occupy the same space without one of them consuming the other. "Behind you," Ava said quietly. "That's what we agreed. You're supposed to be behind me."
I am behind you. I made a phone call. I didn't make a decision. You made a decision to call without telling me. Because you were on the phone with the detective and the call to Janet couldn't wait. He met her eyes. I'm not managing you, Ava. I'm managing the clock. Thursday is tomorrow. She held his gaze, searched for the lie. Searched for the familiar architecture of control dressed up as concern, the Travis-shaped shadow that she now saw in every act of unilateral decision-making, every choice made on her behalf without her input. She didn't find it. What she found instead was exhaustion, genuine, bone-deep, the exhaustion of a man who was trying to keep a promise that required him to fight every instinct he'd ever developed while simultaneously running a tactical operation against a man who had already weaponized his existence. Okay, she said. Okay. Okay. But tomorrow, when we walk into that courtroom, I won't be in the courtroom. She stopped. I can't be, Ava. If I show up at the hearing, his attorney points at me and says, "There's the outlaw biker she's using to intimidate my client." I stay in the parking lot. On the bike, same as Woodward Avenue. You can't spend the rest of your life in parking lots. I can spend tomorrow in one. And that's all we need. Wednesday night at the clubhouse was the quietest night since Ava had arrived. The snow had stopped falling. The temperature had dropped into the negatives. The Harleys outside were encased in ice, their chrome surfaces reflecting the floodlight in distorted patterns that made them look like machines from a dream. Familiar in shape but wrong in texture, frozen in a state that was neither broken nor functional. Ava lay on the couch in the back room. She couldn't sleep. The hearing was 10 hours away. In 10 hours, she would stand in a courtroom and face Travis Reed across a space measured in feet but defined by something immeasurable. The distance between a woman telling the truth and a man whose entire life depended on convincing a judge that the truth was a weapon and he was the victim. She stared at the ceiling, the same water stains, the same clicking space heater, the same framed photograph of young Marines standing in front of a Humvee in a desert that could have been anywhere. She thought about the moment in the elevator, Travis's face, the calculation behind his eyes, even then, even at the point of exposure, still running the numbers, still building the next wall, still engineering the next escape route. She thought about Rebecca sitting in her kitchen with her hands around a mug she never drank from, describing the exact same voice, the exact same words, the exact same architecture of control, and the devastating realization that Ava's suffering was not the act of a man who lost control, but the product of a man who had perfected it. She thought about Sarah Kilman, the woman who vanished, the woman whose name existed only in the memory of the woman who came after her and the files of a company that had let it happen. She thought about her wrist, the bone underneath of the cast, healing slowly, the displacement realigning itself through the slow biological process of repair that no amount of urgency could accelerate. She closed her eyes. In the main room, Kane sat alone at the table. Everyone else had turned in. Logan in the bunk room, Wren in his usual spot on the workshop floor surrounded by parts and tools. The prospects in the storage room they'd converted into sleeping quarters with 2 cots and a space heater that smelled like burning dust. Kane's phone sat on the table in front of him. He was waiting for a call from Janet Polk. She'd driven to Dearborn that afternoon. She'd found Sarah Kilman's mother's house, a small bungalow on a street of small bungalows, each one identical except for the specific ways in which they were deteriorating. The phone rang at 11:47 p.m. "I found her," Janet said. Kane's hand closed around the phone. "Sarah?" "Her mother gave me a number, an out-of-state number. I called it." Sarah answered. She didn't want to talk at first. But when I told her about Ava and Rebecca, when I told her there were 2 other women, she went quiet for a long time. And then she told me everything. Everything? Everything. The control. The isolation. The photographs. Kane, he photographed her without her knowledge in intimate situations, and when she tried to file a complaint, he showed her one of the images on his phone and said, "Think about what happens if these end up where your mother can see them." She withdrew the complaint the same day. She left the company the same week. She moved to Ohio. She changed her phone number. She deleted every social media account she had. She erased herself because she believed it was the only way to survive him. Kane's jaw ached. He realized he'd been clenching it so hard that the muscles had locked. He forced himself to exhale, forced the jaw open, forced air into lungs that felt like they'd been compressed to half their capacity. Will she testify? She'll do more than testify. She kept one of the photographs. The room tilted. Not literally. The walls were solid, the floor was concrete, the physics of the space hadn't changed. But something inside Kane's inner ear, something connected to the part of the brain that processes reality and assigns it weight and dimension, recalibrated. Because what Janet had just said changed everything. A photograph taken without consent, retained by the victim, constituting proof that Travis Reed had created and possessed unauthorized intimate images of a woman he was simultaneously controlling. That wasn't a domestic violence case anymore. That wasn't even an extortion case. That was a criminal pattern spanning years and multiple victims, documented by the victims themselves, each piece of evidence invisible to the others until this moment. Until 3 women who had never spoken to each other were connected by a legal aid attorney and a motorcycle club and a broken wrist that refused to heal quietly. "Get her on the phone with Prosecutor Greer," Kane said. "Tonight if possible, before the hearing." "Already arranged. They're speaking at 6 a.m. "And the photograph?" "Sarah is emailing it to Greer's office with a signed declaration of its origin and the circumstances under which it was taken and retained. It arrives before the hearing." Kane leaned back in his chair. The wood creaked beneath him. The stove had burned down to embers again, casting a dim orange glow across the table, across his hands, across the phone that had become, over the past 5 days, the center of an operation he had never planned and couldn't control. "Janet," he said. "Yeah. Thank you." A pause. "Don't thank me yet. The hearing is tomorrow. Travis's attorney is good. The counter report is already filed. The protective order request is on the docket. If the judge sees a biker club president's sister filing against a clean-cut finance professional with no prior record, the optics start bad regardless of the evidence. The optics change if there are 3 women. The optics change if Greer gets the continuance and the expanded investigation takes over. If the hearing proceeds as scheduled, it's Ava versus Travis. 1 woman, 1 man, 1 judge. And in that room, paper beats bone. A well-crafted counter-narrative beats a cast. Then Greer needs to get the continuance. That's the plan. But plans need judges, and judges are people, and people are unpredictable. Janet paused. "Get some sleep, Kane. Tomorrow is going to be the longest day of your sister's life." She hung up. Kane set the phone down. He stared at it for a long time. Then he stood up and walked to the back room and opened the door quietly and looked at Ava lying on the couch. She was awake. He knew because her breathing was too controlled. The deliberate, measured inhale-exhale of a person pretending to sleep so they won't have to explain why they can't. "Ava?" She opened her eyes. "Yeah." "They found Sarah Kilman. She has evidence. She's talking to the prosecutor at 6 a.m. Ava sat up. The blanket fell away from her shoulders. In the dim light from the hallway, her face was a study in contrasts. Half illuminated, half in shadow. The bruise on her jaw now faded to a yellow-green that looked like something painted rather than inflicted. "Evidence?" "A photograph. One of the ones he took without her knowledge. She kept it." Ava pressed her good hand against her mouth. Not to stifle a cry. She was past crying, but to hold something in. The sound that wanted to come out was not a sob. It was something between a laugh and a scream. The noise the body makes when it receives information that simultaneously confirms its worst fear and offers its first real hope. 3 women, she whispered through her fingers. 3 women, and he still thought he could rewrite it. "Tomorrow we find out if he can." She looked at him. "Kane, whatever happens in that courtroom, I won't be in the courtroom. I know, whatever happens, whatever the judge decides. You need to know something." She lowered her hand. "When I called you from that diner, when I dialed that number I swore I'd never use again, I wasn't calling my brother. I was calling the last person on earth I believed would tell me the truth without wrapping it in something that made it hurt less. I was calling the one person who already knew what this looks like because we grew up inside it." Her voice was steady, quiet. The steadiness of a woman who had found her foundation and was standing on it.
You did what I needed, not what you wanted, and I know what that cost you. Kane leaned against the doorframe. His arms were folded. His eyes were on the floor. The vein in his temple pulsed once, twice, and then went still. Get some sleep, he said. For real this time. Kane. Yeah. If he wins tomorrow, he won't. But if he does... Kane looked up, and in his eyes, those dead, calm eyes that everyone in Michigan associated with violence, with the promise of destruction, with the specific and terrifying silence that preceded the worst things Kane Holloway was capable of, Ava saw something she had never seen before. Not rage, not control, not the practiced restraint of a man keeping the monster behind the wall. Fear. Her brother was afraid. Not of Travis, not of the courtroom, not of the judge or the attorney or the counter-report or the protective order. He was afraid of the one outcome he couldn't fight. The possibility that the system would look at the evidence and the counter-evidence and the two competing narratives and choose wrong. That the man with the corner office would walk out of the courtroom with a legal shield, and the woman with the cast would walk out with nothing but a case number and the knowledge that the truth wasn't enough. If he does, Kane said slowly, then we keep going. Different angle, different strategy, different everything. But we don't stop. Because the one thing I learned in Fallujah that applies to every situation I've been in since, the only thing, is that the side that stops loses. And I don't care if it takes 3 days or 3 years. He doesn't get to win this. Ava nodded. She lay back down, pulled the blanket over her shoulders, closed her eyes. Kane stood in the doorway for another minute. Then he closed the door and walked back to the main room and sat down at the table and stared at the dying embers in the stove and waited for morning. Outside, the temperature hit -11. The Harleys in the lot contracted further, their metal joints popping in the dark like distant gunfire. The Black Vulture's flag above the main door was frozen solid, stiff, brittle, hanging at an angle that made it look like something caught mid-fall. Somewhere in Detroit, Travis Reed was also awake. He was sitting in the apartment that Ava used to share with him, at the desk where he organized his lies, staring at his phone. His attorney had confirmed the hearing. His counter-report was filed. His narrative was in place. The unstable woman, the outlaw bikers, the coordinated harassment campaign against an innocent man. He didn't know about Rebecca's report. He didn't know about Sarah's photograph. He didn't know that the single thread he'd been pulling for years, the thread that kept each woman isolated, silent, and alone, had finally snapped, and the 3 women he'd built his architecture to contain had found each other. He poured another glass of bourbon. He adjusted his tie for tomorrow. He reviewed his prepared statement one more time, each word selected for maximum impact, each sentence designed to project the image of a reasonable man under siege. And in the back room of an outlaw clubhouse 47 miles north, Ava Mercer lay in the dark with her broken wrist pressed against her chest, and her eyes finally closing and the last thought before sleep pulling her under like a current. Tomorrow, she would stand in a courtroom and tell the truth. And for the first time in 2 years, the truth would not be alone. Thursday morning arrived the way all mornings arrive when you haven't slept. Not gradually, not with the gentle transition from dark to light that poets write about, but all at once, like a switch being thrown, the alarm on Kane's phone cutting through the silence of the clubhouse at 5:15 a.m., and the world immediately becoming a thing that required action. He was already sitting up. He'd been sitting up all night at the table, in the same chair, his back against the wall, and his eyes on the door, and his phone on the table in front of him, like a weapon he was waiting to use. The stove had died hours ago. The room was cold enough to see his breath. His coffee mug sat beside the phone, empty, ringed with dried residue, a small brown circle on the wood that looked like a target. His phone buzzed at 5:22 a.m., Janet Polk. Greer spoke with Sarah Kilman at 6 a.m. Eastern. Sarah gave a full statement. The photograph has been received, authenticated, and entered into the expanded case file. Greer is filing an emergency motion for continuance of the protective order hearing this morning, citing new evidence of a multi-victim pattern and the existence of unauthorized intimate images. Will the judge grant it? Greer thinks yes. The photograph changes the weight class. This isn't a domestic dispute anymore, so it's a criminal investigation with federal implications. Any judge who lets a protective order hearing proceed while that investigation is active risks compromising the larger case. Kane exhaled. The breath came out visible in the cold air, a pale column that rose and dissolved. What time is the hearing? 10 a.m., but Greer's motion will be filed by 8. The judge should rule on the continuance before the hearing begins. If it's granted, the hearing is postponed indefinitely pending the investigation.
And if it's denied? Then Ava walks into that courtroom at 10 and tells the truth. Same plan, different odds. Kane hung up. He stared at the phone for a moment. Then he stood, walked to the back room, and knocked twice. "I'm up," Ava said from behind the door. Her voice was clear, not the voice of someone who had just woken. The voice of someone who had been lying in the dark, fully conscious, waiting for the knock the way a soldier waits for the order to move. She opened the door. She was dressed. Her hair was pulled back. The cast on her wrist was visible beneath the sleeve of a dark sweater. She'd stopped hiding it 3 days ago, had started wearing it the way a veteran wears a scar, not as something to conceal, but as something to carry openly, because the hiding was worse than the wound. "News?" she asked. "Greer is filing for a continuance. Sarah's photograph is in the case file. We should know by 8 whether the hearing goes forward." Ava nodded.
She walked past him to the main room, poured coffee from the pot Wren had set up on a timer the night before. One of those small acts of anticipatory care that Wren performed without acknowledgement, the quiet maintenance of a man who understood that in crisis, the difference between collapse and survival was sometimes as simple as hot coffee being ready when someone needed it. She sat down at the table. Kane sat across from her. Neither spoke. The coffee steamed between them. At 7:43 a.m., Logan walked in with snow on his boots and his phone in his hand. He looked at Kane, looked at Ava, set the phone on the table. Greer filed at 7:30. The judge has it. They waited. The next 47 minutes were the longest of Ava Mercer's life. Longer than the minutes in Travis's kitchen when she'd heard the bone in her wrist displace. Longer than the minutes on the phone at the diner when she'd listened to Kane's line ring 6, 7 times before the static shifted. Longer than the minutes in the elevator when she'd stood 2 feet from the man who'd broken her and told him the truth while the doors tried to close between them. She sat at the table with both hands around the coffee mug, one whole, one casted, and stared at the surface of the liquid and watched the small tremors in her hands translate into tiny concentric ripples that spread and died and spread again. The clock on the wall ticked. The stove was cold. The building was silent except for the sound of 5 people breathing and waiting for a phone to ring. At 8:31 a.m., it rang. Janet Polk. Kane answered on speaker. "Granted," Janet said. "Continuance approved. The hearing is postponed indefinitely. The judge cited the existence of new evidence in an active multi-victim investigation and ruled that proceeding with the protective order hearing could prejudice the broader case." The room didn't erupt. Nobody cheered. Nobody exhaled in dramatic relief. What happened instead was subtler and more honest, a slow, collective release of tension that manifested in the small physical adjustments of people who had been holding themselves rigid for days. Logan leaned back in his chair. Wren set down the wrench he'd been gripping. One of the prospects, who had been standing in the doorway pretending he wasn't listening, quietly sat down on the floor and put his head in his hands. Ava set the coffee mug down. Her hands were still shaking, but the shake had changed. No longer the tremor of fear, but the aftershock of a body that had been braced for impact and was now processing the disorientation of the impact not coming. "What happens now?" she said. "Now the investigation expands. Greer's office is coordinating with Vasquez and a federal team that handles cases involving unauthorized intimate images across state lines. Sarah is in Ohio, which makes this interstate. Travis's devices will be subpoenaed, his cloud accounts, his email. Everything he's built over the past several years is about to be opened and examined by people whose job it is to find exactly what he's been hiding. And the counter-report? Against me and Kane? Effectively suspended. The counter-report was filed in the context of the protective order petition. With the petition postponed, the counter-report has no active legal vehicle. It sits in the file, but it has no teeth without the hearing." Ava closed her eyes. For 3 seconds. 4, 5. When she opened them, they were wet. Not crying, not the full collapsing kind, but the slow involuntary leak of a body releasing pressure it had been holding so long that the release itself felt dangerous, like opening a valve on something that had been sealed under maximum capacity. Kane reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the scarred knuckles resting on the white cast. Neither of them looked at each other. They didn't need to. Some things communicate better through the weight of a hand on plaster than through any word in any language. Janet continued, "There's one more thing. Rebecca Soto called Greer's office this morning. She wants to reconnect with Ava, separately from the case. She wants to talk to someone who understands." Ava nodded, just once. "I'll call her," she said. Janet hung up. The phone went dark. The screen reflected the overhead light, and then nothing, just a black rectangle on a wooden table in a room that smelled like cold coffee and old smoke, and the particular scent of an ending. Not the dramatic, explosive kind, but the kind that arrives quietly, without announcement, the way the worst storms end. Not with a final crack of thunder, but with the slow realization that the rain has stopped and you can't remember exactly when. The next 3 weeks unfolded like something being taken apart in reverse. The pieces that had been scattered by the crisis slowly reassembling themselves into shapes that were not the same as before but were recognizable. Functional. Capable of bearing weight. The federal investigation moved with the deliberate, unglamorous pace that real investigations move. Not the cinematic rush of handcuffs and press conferences, but the grinding, meticulous accumulation of evidence by people who understood that the difference between a case that holds and a case that collapses is the quality of the documentation, not the speed of the arrest. Travis Reed's devices were subpoenaed 9 days after the continuance. His personal laptop, his phone, 2 cloud storage accounts, and an external hard drive recovered from a safety deposit box that his attorney had not been informed about. The contents of the hard drive were not disclosed to Ava or Rebecca or Sarah. Not yet, not until the forensic analysis was complete. But the fact that it existed, that Travis had maintained a separate, hidden storage device for materials he didn't want connected to his primary accounts, told the investigators everything they needed to know about the architecture of his behavior. He was suspended from his firm on the 12th day. Not fired, suspended, pending the outcome of the investigation, which was the corporate equivalent of a body being placed on life support. Technically still alive, functionally finished. His access badge was deactivated. His email was locked. His corner office on the 14th floor sat empty, the blinds drawn, the spreadsheet still on the desk, where Ava had set the X-ray 3 weeks earlier. Ava didn't follow the investigation closely. She knew the broad strokes. Vasquez called her once a week with updates that were carefully worded to share progress without compromising the case. But she had made a deliberate decision to step back from the daily machinery of the process. Not because she didn't care, because she understood, with the clarity of a woman who had spent 2 years inside a system of control, that obsessing over the details of her own case was another form of giving Travis Reed tenancy in her mind. And she was done paying that rent. She moved out of the clubhouse on the 10th day. Not because she wanted to leave, or rather, not only because she wanted to leave, but because staying had become its own kind of dependency. And Ava Mercer was a woman who had learned, through the most brutal curriculum imaginable, to recognize the difference between safety and stagnation. The clubhouse had been the place she needed when there was no other place. But it was not the place she was going to rebuild from. She found a studio apartment in Ferndale, 3 miles from the clubhouse, small enough to clean in 20 minutes and large enough to hold an easel. The easel was the first thing she bought. Before the bed frame, before the dishes, before the curtains. She carried it up the stairs with her good arm and set it by the window and stood in front of the blank canvas and felt something stir in the part of her chest that Travis had spent 2 years trying to seal shut. She didn't paint that day. Or the next. But the easel was there. The space was there. And for the first time in longer than she could calculate, the possibility was there. The possibility that she might, eventually, pick up a brush and make something that existed only because she wanted it to. Kane helped her move. He carried boxes up the stairs and assembled the bed frame with a socket wrench and the silent, concentrated efficiency of a man who had built and rebuilt field structures in places where getting it wrong meant someone died. He didn't linger. He didn't hover. He set up the bed, checked the locks on the door and windows, and stood in the middle of the empty apartment looking at the space with the expression of a man who was trying to see it the way she saw it, not as a room that needed to be secured, but as a room that needed to be lived in. "It's good," he said. "It's small. It's yours." 2 words. The weight they carried had nothing to do with real estate. He left. Rode back to the clubhouse on the Harley. The sound of the engine faded down the street, and Ava stood in her new apartment alone for the first time in 10 days and felt the silence settle around her like water filling a vessel. Not the silence of isolation. She'd lived inside that silence for 2 years and knew its texture, its temperature, its specific gravity. This was a different silence. The silence of a space that belonged to her. The silence of 4 walls that no one else had a key to. The silence of a woman standing in the center of her own life and deciding, without consultation or permission, what happened next. She sat on the floor. She didn't cry. She breathed. Kane started seeing a counselor on the 14th day. Not because he wanted to, not because anyone in the Black Vultures suggested it. The culture of the club did not include the word counselor in its active vocabulary, and the idea of Kane Holloway sitting in an office talking to a stranger about his feelings was so incongruent with his established identity that even Logan, when he found out, had to sit quietly for a full minute before formulating a response. The counselor's name was David Marsh. He worked out of a VA clinic in Flint that smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and served coffee from a machine that produced a liquid bearing only a theoretical relationship to actual coffee. David was 58 years old, a former Army psychologist who had spent 20 years listening to men describe things that no civilian vocabulary was equipped to contain. He had a beard. He wore flannel. He did not flinch when Kane walked in wearing his leather cut and sat down with the specific coiled tension of a man who had been persuaded to do something he fundamentally believed was unnecessary. "What brings you in?" David said. "My sister," Kane said. "What about your sister?" "She told me that my version of love looks the same as the thing she just escaped. Different hands, same grip." He paused. "I need to know if she's right." David studied him for a moment, not with the assessing, categorizing gaze that Kane had received from every therapist who'd ever looked at his file and seen the words combat veteran and motorcycle club president and immediately slotted him into a framework. David looked at him the way Logan looked at him, directly, without preconception, with the patience of a man who understood that the first thing said in a room like this was almost never the real thing. "Is she right?" David asked. Kane didn't answer for a long time. The clock on the wall ticked. The coffee machine gurgled. Outside the window, the Flint skyline sat low and gray against a sky that had been the same color for weeks. "I don't know," Kane said. "That's why I'm here." It was the most honest thing he'd said in 20 years. He went back the following week, and the week after that. He didn't tell the club. He didn't make announcements. He just disappeared on Tuesday afternoons and came back quieter, and the men who knew him well enough to notice the change were wise enough not to comment on it. Logan noticed. Of course Logan noticed. Logan noticed everything. It was the quality that had made him an exceptional sergeant and an invaluable vice president and an impossible person to keep secrets from. But he said nothing. He simply started leaving a fresh pot of coffee on the table for when Kane returned on Tuesday evenings, and the two of them would sit in silence and drink and not discuss what had happened or what was happening or what would happen next, because some forms of support are expressed not through words, but through the consistent, unremarkable presence of a person who shows up at the same table at the same time and doesn't ask why you look different today. Ren, meanwhile, did what Ren always did. He maintained. He checked on Ava's wrist at her apartment once a week, not as a doctor, because he wasn't one, but as a man with combat medical training who understood orthopedic healing timelines and wanted to make sure her range of motion was progressing. He brought food, not because she asked, because Ren had learned a long time ago in a dusty aid station in Helmand province that people who are rebuilding themselves from damage forget to eat, and the person who remembers for them is performing a service that no one will ever adequately thank them for, and that matters more than almost anything else. Ava called Rebecca on the 17th day. They met at a coffee shop in Midtown. Neutral ground, neither woman's territory, a place where they could sit across from each other without the weight of history pressing down from the walls. They talked for 3 hours. Not about Travis, not about the investigation. About everything else? The things that existed outside the damage? The parts of themselves that he had tried to erase but hadn't quite managed to reach. Rebecca was writing again. She'd started a journal the week after she filed her report, and the entries had grown from single sentences to full pages to something that was beginning to look like the outline of a book she didn't know she was going to write. "I keep thinking about Sarah," Rebecca said. "The years she spent disappeared, the life she had to erase just to feel safe." "She's coming back," Ava said. Slowly. "Janet told me she's been in contact with Greer's office regularly. She's talking. Talking is the hardest part." "No." Ava looked at her coffee. "Talking is the second hardest part. The hardest part is deciding you're worth hearing." On the 21st day, Travis Reed was formally charged. The charges were filed in federal court due to the interstate nature of the unauthorized images. Sarah being in Ohio, the images having been transmitted digitally across state lines. The specific charges were not disclosed publicly at that stage, but Vasquez called Ava and told her that the scope of the charges reflected the full breadth of the investigation. "He's not going to be able to rewrite this one," Vasquez said. Ava held the phone and looked out the window of her apartment at the Ferndale Street below. A man walking a dog, a woman pushing a stroller, a delivery truck double parked outside a bakery. The ordinary world. The world that keeps moving while extraordinary things happen to the people inside it. "Thank you," Ava said. "You did the work. All three of you." After she hung up, Ava sat on the floor in front of the easel and picked up a brush for the first time in 2 years. Her right hand, the one with the cast that was scheduled to come off in 4 days, couldn't hold it. So she used her left. The strokes were clumsy, imprecise. The lines went where they wanted instead of where she directed them. The colors bled into each other in ways she hadn't intended. She didn't care. She painted for 40 minutes. She didn't paint anything recognizable. No landscape, no portrait, no image that could be named or categorized. Just color, just movement, just the physical act of a hand applying pigment to a surface because a woman decided to. When she stopped, her left hand was cramped and streaked with blue, and her eyes were burning, and the canvas in front of her looked like a bruise. Layers of purple and blue and green bleeding into yellow at the edges, the exact color progression of a wound healing, of damage transitioning through its phases, of something broken slowly becoming something else. She left it on the easel. She didn't throw it away. She didn't explain it. She just let it exist. The cast came off on a Tuesday, 25 days after the break. The orthopedic resident, the same young, efficient, kind one who had set it, cut through the plaster with a small, oscillating saw that sounded like a dentist's drill and felt like the vibration of a Harley engine transmitted through bone. The skin underneath was pale and shrunken and smelled like something that had been sealed away from the world for too long. The wrist was stiff. The range of motion was limited. Physical therapy would take weeks, but the bone had healed. The displacement had realigned. The fracture lines, visible on the follow-up X-ray, were already filling in with new growth. The body's own repair mechanism, slow and biological, and completely indifferent to the circumstances that had caused the damage in the first place. Bone doesn't care why it broke. It only knows how to rebuild. Ava left the hospital and drove to the Royal Oak Diner on Route 12. She didn't plan it. She just drove south, and the car found its way to the parking lot the way bodies find their way to the places where things began. The diner looked the same. The neon. The cracked asphalt. The boarded-up radiator shop next door. The lot full of dead Chevrolets. Donna was behind the counter, same apron, same tired eyes, same particular way of existing inside a space that had absorbed decades of other people's emergencies without ever changing its wallpaper. Ava sat at the counter. Donna brought her coffee without asking. "The wrist," Donna said, glancing at the pale, uncasted arm. "Healing." "You?" Ava considered the question, not the polite automatic consideration that people give to casual inquiries, but the real kind. The kind where you actually check the state of the infrastructure before you answer. "Getting there," she said. Donna nodded. She didn't push. She refilled the coffee. At 6:47 p.m., the sound came through the windows, the deep, unmistakable growl of a Harley V-twin turning off Route 12 into the lot. Then a second, then a third. Ava turned on her stool. 3 bikes pulled into the lot. Kane in front on his Road King, Logan beside him on the Electra Glide. Ren behind them on a Sportster that looked like it had been rebuilt from parts of 4 different motorcycles. Because it had. Ren built his bikes the way he treated patients, with whatever materials were available and an almost irrational faith that functionality could be achieved through improvisation. They parked. They dismounted. They walked inside. 3 men in leather, wet from the road, moving through the diner door with the particular collective weight that made every other patron look up, and then, after a moment, look back down. Not from fear, not this time, but from the recognition that the men entering were not looking for trouble. They were looking for someone. They found her at the counter. Kane sat down on the stool beside Ava. Logan took the one on her other side. Ren leaned against the counter between them, like a man who didn't need a seat because he was accustomed to standing. In operating rooms, in aid stations, in the spaces between other people's crises, where the only useful position was vertical. Donna looked at the 3 of them, then at Ava. Something in her expression shifted. Not surprise, but a quiet, weathered understanding. The look of a woman who had seen enough midnights in this diner to recognize the difference between people who arrive in groups because they're looking for a fight and people who arrive in groups because they are, in the most fundamental and inarticulate way, a family. She pulled 3 mugs from the shelf, poured coffee, set them down. "On the house," she said, "all 4 of you." They drank in silence for a while. The diner's jukebox was playing something old and country, the kind of song that exists in diners at dusk, the way dust exists in sunlight, always there, barely noticed, part of the texture of the space itself. "Cast is off," Kane said, looking at her wrist. "This morning." "How's it feel?" Ava rotated her wrist slowly. The movement was limited. 30 degrees of flexion where there should have been 80, a stiffness in the joint that the physical therapist said would improve over weeks and months, but might never fully resolve. "Stiff," she said. "Weak. Different." Different how? She looked at her wrist, at the pale skin, at the place where the fracture had been, now invisible on the surface, still present in the bone, a memory encoded in calcium and collagen that her body would carry for the rest of its life. "It healed crooked," she said. "Not much. A few degrees off from where it was before. The doctor said I might not even notice." She paused. "But I'll know it's there. The angle that's not quite right. The thing that healed, but healed different." Kane looked at her. And in that look, the look of a man who had spent 20 years carrying fractures of his own, some visible, some buried so deep that no X-ray would ever find them, there was something she hadn't seen before. Not sympathy, not pity, not the performative understanding of someone who wants you to feel heard. Recognition. The recognition of a person who knows exactly what it means to heal crooked, to survive something and come out the other side functional, but fundamentally altered, carrying a bend in the structure that wasn't there before and will never be corrected, and learning to live with that bend, not as a flaw, but as a record. A document. The body's own testimony of what happened and what was survived. "Mine's my left hand," Kane said. He held it up. The 3rd knuckle sat slightly lower than the others. A dislocation from a fight years ago that had been set by Ren in a garage using ice and a splint made from a tongue depressor and electrical tape. "Healed crooked. Never went back to how it was. I notice it every time I grip the bars." "Does it bother you?" He closed the hand, opened it. "It used to. Now it's just the way my hand works." Ava looked at his hand, then at her wrist, then at the coffee mug in front of her, held between fingers that were still relearning how to grip. "Yeah," she said. "I think I understand that." Logan drained his coffee and set the mug down with a sound that was gentle despite the size of his hands. He looked at Ava with the steady, unhurried gaze of a man who had something to say and was going to take exactly as long as he needed to say it. "My ex-wife's name was Caroline," he said. "I don't talk about her. But you should know that what you did, the report, the office, the standing up, she didn't get to do that. She didn't have the people around her to make it possible. And I've spent a lot of years thinking about what might have been different if she had." He paused. The diner was quiet around them. "So when I say I'm proud of you, I need you to understand that I'm not saying it lightly, and I'm not saying it only about you." Ava looked at him. This man she had known for less than a month, this silver-bearded stranger who had opened a locked room for her on the worst night of her life, and who had quietly, systematically, without fanfare or expectation of gratitude, helped build the infrastructure that made it possible for her to fight. "Thank you, Logan," she said. He nodded once. That was enough. Some men say everything they need to say with a single nod, and Logan was one of them. Wren ordered pie, because Wren always ordered pie when it was available, on the grounds that life was short and uncertain, and any establishment that offered pie deserved to have it purchased. He ate it standing at the counter, fork in one hand, coffee in the other, looking perfectly content in a way that seemed almost radical given the context. The specific, unapologetic contentment of a man who had learned through years of exposure to the worst things human beings could do to each other, to take pleasure in the small, unremarkable acts of living whenever the opportunity arose. "She makes good pie," Wren said to Donna. "I'll tell the cook." The cook already knows. They stayed at the diner for an hour. The light outside shifted from the gray of afternoon to the blue of early evening. The neon in the windows flickered on, red, then white, then the specific pink that neon produces when two colors overlap. The parking lot filled with the quiet sounds of Route 12 at dusk. Trucks downshifting, tires on wet asphalt, the distant sound of someone's radio playing through a rolled-down window despite the cold. When they left, Ava stood in the lot between the three Harleys and looked at the diner. The same cracked vinyl booths, the same counter, the same window where she'd pressed her forehead against the glass 25 days ago while whispering into a borrowed phone. "I'm going to come back here," she said. "Not because I need to, because I want to." Kane looked at the diner, at the neon, at the counter where Donna was wiping down the surface with the same rag she'd used 10,000 times before. "Sundays," he said. "What?" "I'll meet you here. Sundays, if you want." She looked at him. Her brother. The man who had ridden through a snowstorm to reach her, who had sat on a frozen motorcycle outside a glass tower for 2 hours while she fought a war he wasn't allowed to enter, who had learned, painfully, imperfectly, with the kind of grinding difficulty that comes from rewriting your own operating system while it's still running, to stand behind her instead of in front of her. "Sundays," she said. They rode north. 3 Harleys in formation on Route 12, engines harmonizing in the cold evening air, headlights cutting through the dusk. Ava followed in her car, the headlights of the Harleys reflected in her rear-view mirror, 3 points of light moving together through the dark, steady and deliberate, the way stars move across a sky that doesn't ask them to explain where they're going. At the turnoff to Ferndale, she blinked her lights once. Kane raised a hand. Logan raised a hand. Wren, who was already reaching for the thermos of coffee he kept bungee-corded to the Sportster's rear rack, raised nothing but somehow communicated the same thing. Ava turned off. The Harleys continued north. The sound of their engines faded until it was just a vibration in the air, and then just a memory of a vibration, and then silence. She drove to her apartment, parked, climbed the stairs, unlocked the door, stood in the center of the room. The easel was by the window. The painting, the bruise-colored canvas she'd made with her left hand, was still there. In the evening light coming through the glass, the colors looked different, warmer. The purple had deepened. The blue had shifted towards something almost like the sky outside. The yellow at the edges glowed. She looked at her wrist, turned it slowly, felt the stiffness, the limited range, the few degrees of difference that would be there forever. Then she picked up a brush with her right hand. The grip was weak. The fingers didn't close all the way. The angle of her wrist was slightly off. Those few degrees, the crooked healing, the body's record of what had happened. She touched the brush to the canvas. One stroke. Thin, unsteady, the line of a hand that was relearning itself. She made another. And somewhere on a highway heading north, Kane Holloway rode with the wind against his face, and the engine beneath him, and the taste of diner coffee still on his tongue, and the knowledge, settled deep in the bone, in the place where the fractures live, that protecting someone doesn't always mean standing between them and the thing that hurts. Sometimes it means standing far enough away that they can see their own hands. Sometimes it means learning to be quiet while someone else learns to be loud. Sometimes it means sitting on a frozen motorcycle in a parking lot for 2 hours doing nothing, because nothing is the hardest and most necessary thing you've ever done. The road stretched north. The headlights cut the dark. The engines of 3 Harleys and the silence of a woman painting alone in an apartment in Ferndale filled the Michigan night with the same thing, expressed in different frequencies. The sound of people who had been broken finding out, slowly and imperfectly, and with no guarantee of getting it right, how to hold the pieces without cutting themselves on the edges. No one was fixed. No one was whole. No one had arrived at the kind of ending where the music swells and the credits roll and every wound has been healed by the final frame. But Ava was painting. And Kane was learning to sit in a room and talk to a stranger about the shape of his own damage. And Logan had said Caroline's name out loud for the first time in 11 years. And Wren had eaten pie. And on Sunday morning, 3 Harleys would pull into the lot of the Royal Oak Diner on Route 12. And a woman with a crooked wrist would be sitting at the counter waiting, and Donna would pour 5 coffees without being asked. And for 1 hour, in a cracked vinyl booth in a diner between a boarded-up radiator shop and a lot full of dead Chevrolets, the world would be exactly small enough and exactly warm enough and exactly quiet enough to survive.